the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine widens, our hearts continue to go out to the country and its courageous citizenry. Here at the University of South Florida, I want to express our deep support for our Ukrainian students, faculty, and staff. USF is proud to partner with leading experts and organizations to bring to you the latest insights on how the evolving situation in Ukraine impacts the world and you through the Ukraine What's Next series. Today, we focus on financial and economic impacts with partners Cumberland Advisors and the Global Interdependence Center. Thank you to our sponsors, presenters, and partners, and we hope you enjoy the program.
I'm Casey Welch. I'm the director of the Institute for Public Policy and Leadership here at the University of South Florida. The Institute's mission is to combine the strong academic resources of the University of South Florida with global and local experts to discuss issues of great concern to our community and our country, and we're following that with this continued series on Ukraine. I want to take the opportunity right now to give a special thanks to our partners for this series, the Air Force Association of the West Coast of Florida chapter, the Florida Center for Cybersecurity, Security Management International, the University of South Florida Sarasota Manatee Campus, the Global Interdependence Center, and Research One at the University of South Florida. Now it's my pleasure to introduce the Chancellor of the University of South Florida Sarasota Manatee Campus, Dr. Karen Holbrook.
Thank you, Casey, and good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are in the world today. We are delighted to welcome you to our fourth in the series of Ukraine What's Next. This one on humanitarian issues and policy is particularly in the sweet spot of universities, which have been focused on humanitarian strategies to support students around the world forever. In a recent video with President Zelensky and the presidents of several U.S. universities from the Association of American Universities, Zelensky called upon these universities to provide expertise in defense, cybersecurity, aeronautics, and healthcare to Ukraine, which no longer has universities, libraries, or research facilities. He's asking our universities to help rebuild the curriculum, to help rebuild programs, and to bring back the wonderful education system and to expand it even more in Ukraine once the war ends. Our universities are doing a lot here for Ukraine as well. We are offering students, in many cases, free tuition, providing scholarships to students, providing housing, bringing students over, bringing scholars to this country. So this is a particularly important one to us, and even to us on our Sarasota Manatee campus, which is the smallest of the three University of South Florida campuses. We are welcoming 2 Ukraine students to our program on hospitality and tourism in the fall, and we will have an open door to whatever we can be able to do to help Ukraine in the future. And I think sessions like this, where we inform our population, where we inform the public, where we inform our own people within the university of what is needed and what is so important to us in this country. So thank you for being with us. Thank you for spending your time, and have a wonderful session. I know this one's going to be very, very interesting. So thank you.
Well, good morning. I'm General Gray, President of the West Coast Chapter of the Florida Air Force Association. And again, I'd like to welcome everybody for joining in on this remarkable series, these forums we've had so far. Today marks 3 months since Russia invaded Ukraine. Russia, in the world's opinion, has probably underachieved, and Ukraine has overachieved. Ukraine has mounted a remarkable defense, and today we're going to hear from a couple of experts that'll help explain how that came about. Today, Kyiv is beginning to experience an almost sense of normalcy, marked by the return of businesses, embassies, and teens to the mall. But there is a grave humanitarian crisis with millions of people in dire need, including those who have fled across borders, which is an estimated 12 million, the vast majority of which are women and children, and many more who are on the move inside the country or unable to leave because they're encircled by the Russian forces in their cities and their towns. In 3 months, it has become the largest movement of people in Europe since World War II. The conflict continues with the humanitarian crisis that is unfolding today, tomorrow, and in years to come. We learned in session 2 that Ukraine produces 30% of the world's wheat supply. We're going to see global famine as an implication of the Russians not allowing that wheat to be harvested, well, number one, planted, then harvested and exported to the countries that have depended upon the Ukrainian wheat supply for so many years. Our first forum focused on the military aspects, and we had a former SACEUR, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, General Phil Breedlove, to come in and talk about the military implications, the background, the buildup, and the implications of NATO, Article 5, and the potential of Finland and Sweden joining up, which, as we've all seen, unfold just as he predicted. In our second forum, Cumberland Associates helped join with us, partner with us, and talk about the financial impacts to the world markets, and including impacts to the food supply. And we're seeing that unfold. Our third series was on cyber. This is the first widespread use of cyber in a modern-day conflict, and it is showing us the ways that I think future wars are going to be prosecuted, where you're going to see social media play and attacks on all kinds of institutions such as utilities, financial markets, and stuff in the future. Russia has received an awful lot of this cyber stuff, as we learned also, which was probably not expected by the Russians. Today, we're going to focus on domestic and humanitarian efforts, and I think it's going to be absolutely a dynamic, fast-moving discussion as we go along. If you have not seen the previous 3 forums, you can get them from YouTube. We'll put a link up here. It'll show it to you. And please focus in on the last panel on cyber. It was extremely dynamic, and I think it lays a great foundation for where we're headed next. So with that, Casey, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, General Gray. We appreciate, again, your partnership. Now it's my pleasure to introduce a distinguished faculty member here at the University of South Florida, Sarasota-Mantee campus, from our College of Arts and Sciences. Joining us from overseas, Dr. Jody McBrien.
Okay, hello, bonjour from Paris, and thank you for taking part in this webinar on the crisis in Ukraine. And so now I will share my screen for my presentation. I think. Oops. So are you seeing my screen? I think so. Okay.
Yes, Dr. McBrien.
Okay, thank you so much, Casey. Okay, and forgive me, I'm going to be looking to my left, not to you, as I give this presentation because I'm working off of 2 computers. So you've heard about the military responses and political challenges to this unprovoked tragedy from people far more knowledgeable about military operations than I. I can say some about what France and the OECD are doing in response and about the situation for refugees. For the past 20 years, I have worked with repercussions of conflict and war, namely civilians who are either stuck in highly insecure situations within their countries as internally displaced persons or IDPs, or as refugees or asylum seekers who leave their homelands seeking a safe place to live. My work has been limited to working with students and families in ways to support academic success and social integration. I really appreciate the opportunity to provide a snapshot of what is happening to Ukrainian citizens who've been thrown into a situation of war, fighting for their lives and those of their children. Since last July, I've been working at the OECD, the Organization for Economic and Cooperative Development, in Paris, as a Council on Foreign Relations Fellow. Many of you will know that this organization developed from the European Agency, the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, which channeled money to Western European states as a part of the Marshall Plan after World War II. The team I was assigned to examines equity and inclusion for diverse populations, including refugees. These bubbles compare only 18 days of refugees from Ukraine with countries' largest one-year increases in refugees. Ukraine is the purple at 2,800,000 just through March 13th. At present, there are over 6 million Ukrainians who have fled to neighboring countries. Roughly half of that number includes young people of primary, secondary, or tertiary school age. To the left is Venezuela at 2,900,000 from the years 2017 to 2018. To the right, Afghanistan with 2,145,000 in 1993 to 1994, followed by Syria at 1,754,000 in the years 2012 to 2013. Then come Iraq, South Sudan, Ethiopia, and Liberia. In terms of total numbers, Ukraine's displaced, which is refugees and internally displaced people, in 3 months are just under Syria's since 2019, and Venezuela's refugee-only numbers since 2014. So this is a phenomenal number of civilians. On the positive side, European countries have so far been highly welcoming to most of the refugees, although there have been troubling reports about Roma, LGBTQI, and non-white refugees, such as African students in Ukraine. At the OECD, parents of my young colleagues from Germany and Slovakia have taken refugees into their homes. As history has shown, though, societies grow weary over time, especially under enormous burdens. Additionally, the border countries to which most refugees are fleeing, such as Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania, are not wealthy countries, and they do not have recent histories of taking in large numbers of refugees, as do some other European countries, since 2015. In fact, these are countries, as was Ukraine, that blocked refugees from Syria, Afghanistan, Venezuela, Eritrea, and other countries from finding refuge in their countries in recent years. Capacity is a major issue. Krakow's population rose by over 20% in a matter of weeks. Schools already struggling with teacher shortages have had to admit many children who do not know the language of instruction and enter with symptoms of trauma. The European Parliament has adopted the Cohesion Action for Refugees in Europe measures to help EU countries provide emergency support, such as temporary accommodation, food and water, medical care, and education. It also activated the Temporary Protection Directive, allowing displaced Ukrainian resident permits the right to work, housing, and access to social welfare and medical assistance for at least 1 year. The right to temporary protection is immediate, meaning that when a person wants to receive it, all they need to do is follow the instructions of the national authorities and demonstrate to them the nationality, international protection status, or equivalent protection status, residence in Ukraine or family link as appropriate, which gives the right to temporary protection. Getting to countries outside the EU, such as the United States, is much more difficult, so European countries are likely to be burdened by the numbers. Uneven estimates are that Poland has taken in over 3 million refugees now, and city populations are up by 12 to 53%. The country and other border countries are scrambling to find temporary housing and provide essential services. There are well-founded fears of food, housing, energy, and education shortages coming in the fall and winter. Currently, there are only about 70,000 Ukrainians who have come to France as a result of the war, and about 50,000 of them are in Paris. Most are preferring to stay closer to home in hopes that they can return, and some tend to have family in border countries. However, some, in particular, the kind of refugees I have begun to work with, who are doubly marginalized because of their sexual orientation, their race, or their marital status, such as being single mothers, are likely to migrate further than the conservative border countries. Poland and Hungary, for example, have terrible human rights records with respect to LGBTQI populations. The immediate needs are not surprising. Currently, a major challenge in this area is accommodation. I have read with real concern that in some instances, refugees from Afghanistan and Syria are being evicted to provide shelter to Ukrainian refugees. This has been happening in Germany, a country that has had some of the more liberal policies in Europe with respect to refugees and asylum seekers. I worry that this will cause long-term unrest in these places by refugees who understandably perceive such actions to be discriminatory. I already mentioned some long-term consequences, and these will go beyond refugees and even beyond Ukraine and border countries. Energy needs and food, as many European countries have depended on Russia for oil, and Ukraine is a major world supplier of grain. In EC meetings, Ukrainian officials are preferring not to use the term refugee because of their expectations and their hopes that Ukrainians can come back as soon as there is peace and to begin to rebuild the country. Sadly, there are no predictions for a quick end to this war, and even if there were, Russia has destroyed so many homes, businesses, and schools that many people have little to return to. Therefore, there are short through long-term needs to help people deal with trauma and grief, and these needs are in their mother tongue. Host countries are struggling to provide adequate psychosocial relief. After the immediacy of displacement, Ukrainians will need to create a new sense of identity and belonging. This will include a need to learn the language of their host country and find jobs, as they may be away for years, and some will likely not return to Ukraine. The current situation for Ukrainian children who have fled to other countries is that they are likely without their fathers, as men who can fight have been required to stay and fight. This creates not only fear and anxiety for the children, but also for their mothers. Because so many remain hopeful that they will return soon, some have not registered in local host schools. And for some, enrolling has proven difficult to impossible because the schools do not have capacity for all the newcomers. In Warsaw, for example, as many as 80% of Ukrainian students are not attending public schools. During the pandemic, Ukraine created the All-Ukrainian Online School to provide lessons for students in grade 5 and above. And they have been able to bring this back during the war. So many who have internet access are now using this method of schooling. However, it is not available for younger students, and EU law requires that new students be registered to attend local schools within 3 months. There has been flexibility for this semester, but it will be a problem in the fall. There were teacher shortages before the war began, and now they are critical. The students are also in need of language learning in order to succeed in local schools, as well as psychosocial services. One way that countries are working to fill the demand is by hiring Ukrainian teachers or as teaching assistants. There are benefits and challenges to this. Of course, the benefits are that Ukrainian students can feel a sense of connection to Ukrainian teachers, and they will have the same language. The challenges, of course, are that all countries have credentialing requirements for teachers, and For Ukrainian teachers to teach in a full teaching assignment, they need to not only know fluently the host language, but also the curriculum of the country. Countries are looking also for psychologists who speak Ukrainian to assist with psychosocial support. It's also important to note the usefulness of extracurricular opportunities, such as sports and arts. In these kinds of ways, language is a little bit less important, and sometimes students will be able to excel in sports or in art and gain themselves a sense of belonging even before they feel confident with the language. Although people think of food, shelter, medical, and psychological services as primary needs for refugees, child refugees need to be able to continue their education, both in the short and long term. For children, school is their life, and it provides them with a sense of security, stability, and well-being. Long term, of course, it is crucial to their life success. Children who lose years of education due to civil and political unrest may never have the opportunity to have decent employment because they will not have sufficient education to make such choices. Of course, moving into a new country with a different language, culture, and curriculum causes upheaval in children's lives. And they're already dealing with anxiety, fear, trauma, and depression in many cases. Teachers are often their lifeline in educational and cultural brokering. Sadly, few schools of education prepare pre-service teachers to support immigrant students, much less refugees. I have watched as United States colleges of education have cut requirements for multicultural education over the past couple decades, and it is very short-sighted. We have to stop teaching and training to some imaginary norm. Teachers need this kind of support because many of these children have needs that are beyond the so-called average student. Additionally, teachers are being asked to take on larger classes of students. Pre-service courses and ongoing professional learning are helpful and effective. Simply knowing that you can help a child feel welcome by learning hello in their language, a few basic phrases, and how to pronounce the child's name correctly can go a long way in raising a teacher's confidence and helping her feel effective and helping the child feel welcome. And there are many more techniques that can support both the students and teachers who have so much responsibility for them. These include creating buddy systems with local children, providing holistic services, and including informal education opportunities, such as art and sport that I mentioned earlier. It's obvious that children of different ages have different developmental needs, as well as academic ones. Due to time, I will concentrate on older students. Some are at a point where they need to pass comprehensive secondary education exams in order to apply to university. In simple terms, the 1997 EU Lisbon Convention states that signatory nations must develop procedures to assess credentials of displaced persons to enter higher education. However, the 2019 Eurydice report on integrating asylum seekers and refugees into European higher education institutions indicates that just over half of EU states have steering documents on higher education that explicitly refer to asylum seekers and refugees, and the details vary widely. Germany has stood out with a comprehensive policy approach that includes recognition of qualifications and prior learning, academic support services, counseling services, and financial support. It has a specially targeted program that funds academic language and introductory courses for refugees at 170 universities and preparatory colleges. Over 10,000 places have been created annually to support refugee education. Of course, other European nations either have or are currently creating policies to address needs of Ukrainian students. Turkey is another country that has initiated academic and financial reforms to support the largest Syrian refugee population in Europe. These have included exempting Syrian refugee students from paying tuition at public universities. Oops, sorry. A March QS article provides numerous examples and websites to reference worldwide opportunities. Additionally, a website called Science for Ukraine, also referenced by the QS article, is providing links to international opportunities for researchers and students in need of placements, jobs, and other support, as is the Ukraine Network website and Refugees Welcome Map. I will be presenting more about this in an upcoming QS conference on the European higher education response to Ukraine next week. It's important to note how quickly social empathy can change to frustration or indifference. Being aware of challenges to support can help increase public understanding. As such, many experts have noted that some European countries have been highly welcoming of Ukrainian refugees, but refused entry to Syrian or African or Afghani refugees. People in need are people in need. This kind of difference in welcome indicates prejudice that can result in death to refugees from countries that are not welcomed. There has been a history of misinformation about refugees, that they're terrorists, that they have no interest in integrating into the host country, that they're there to take advantage of social services, to take jobs of native citizens. Research shows that refugees, especially when they are welcomed and offered help, become model citizens. They're grateful for the safety of another country and they want to give back. They want to restart their lives and they want their children to have opportunities. They can be highly entrepreneurial and they contribute to the budget of their host country. Although first given assistance, after several years, their financial contributions more than pay off. Another point I'd like to make is that we need to model empathy and kindness towards Russian people. I tend to say that being American is an accident of my birth. I did nothing to earn the privilege. The same goes to everyone. I think with great sadness of the attacks on people of Chinese descent when COVID grew into a pandemic. Now I see things like Russian studies being pulled from schools and universities. Many Russians have put themselves in danger protesting Putin's war. We need to separate the brutality caused by a despot from the rich culture and the individuals of Russian heritage. So, how to conclude a presentation like this? History provides lessons that refugee situations are increasingly protracted and countries increasingly reluctant to help with the numerous crises that have occurred since World War II. In part, this is because of stretched resources that result in shortages in host countries. In part, it is because of negative misinformation that leads the public to fear and distrust, especially when refugees are of different races, ethnicities, and religions from the dominant host culture. Fortunately, there are some excellent NGOs that are working to help local societies with ways to interact and understand newcomers. One of my favorites is Welcoming America, which operates using Gordon Allport's contact theory to help local and new populations recognize their similar values. It also has international outreach. Another is Not a Column, an organization that I use in my classes that connects people with worldwide refugees online to hold conversations. Universally, my students have said this is the best assignment they have ever had at university, as it brings them face to face with a refugee to learn what this journey really means in a personal way. Locally, there are numerous NGOs in the Tampa area that can use volunteer help. To learn more, you can contact my friend, Janet Blair, the Regional Refugee Services Liaison at the Florida Department of Child and Family Services, or my friend, Ivis Triana, Director of Refugee Services, Florida Lutheran Family Services in Sarasota. On a recent Florida Refugee Task Force meeting online, we were discussing the challenges Ukrainians are facing as they reach Florida from Mexico, as they do not have legal documentation, so cannot access services available to documented refugees, such as work permits. Unlike Ukrainian refugees in the EU, those attempting to go to the US must provide multiple forms of documentation and undergo rigorous interview processes that take a great deal of time. Unfortunately, those attempting to enter the US without passing through these channels may find themselves placed in detention centers, which are highly inappropriate for people experiencing severe grief and trauma. So those are my remarks, and I thank you for your attention.
Well, Doctor, thank you very much. Very insightful, and you brought up some issues that I'm sure the majority of Americans had not considered in this educational aspect. You brought up the online schooling, which begs the question, access to the internet, and do the majority of these young kids have iPads, computers, that kind of stuff? Could you address that, please?
Sure. Absolutely. There are two issues with the online schooling. Well, there are actually three. One is that no, not all of the refugees do have access to online. The second is that the online school only begins at grade 5, so younger students cannot access it. And the third issue is that once you are in another European country, you are supposed to register into a public school within 3 months. So this is going to become a major issue. It's, since February, we're at 3 months. They have been flexible, but going past the summer vacation is going to be a real challenge.
Right. Your passion really comes through, and I want to commend you and thank you for that. Not your area of expertise, but we had a question about adoptions. There are many, many children adopted in the past from Ukraine. What's going on now?
I honestly do not know. I do not know. I wish I could address it. I don't.
Okay. Well, like I said, not your area. Maybe we'll be able to address that later on with another panelist. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your involvement. And we really appreciate you sharing your insights with us this morning.
My pleasure. Nice to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, it's now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for the day, Mr. Tom Callahan, who is the Vice President of the international nonprofit organization Civilian Research and Development Foundation Global, or CRDF Global. Tom joined the organization 3 years ago after a distinguished career in government and industry. Tom has had several tours on Capitol Hill, serving on both the Senate Foreign Relations and the House Foreign Affairs Committees. At the Department of State in the 2000s, Tom served under both Secretary Colin Powell and Secretary Condoleezza Rice in the offices of Policy Planning, Diplomatic Security, and Legislative Affairs. In 2007, he joined Lockheed Martin and left in 2011 when they spun off their subsidiary, PAE, where Tom served as a vice president until 2016. Another stint in the Senate, this time focused on weapons of mass destruction, counterterrorism, security assistance, and political military affairs generally. Tom joined CRDF Global with a portfolio in strategy, innovation, and evaluation. Over the course of his varied career, Tom has lived or worked in 75 countries. He attended Dartmouth College and Yale Law School, where he focused on international law. His most recent travel was in March and April for 4 weeks in Poland, and all through Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania, along with the borders, all of which border Ukraine. He lives in Alexandria, Virginia. I dare say we could not have had a better keynote speaker for today's subject. So, Tom, thank you very much, and over to you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that kind invitation. Can you all hear me all right? We're good? You know, as you mentioned, I was recently in Poland in the region for 4 weeks. What you didn't mention is that it was the first time in a couple of years that I'd climbed out of my basement COVID burrow and traveled internationally. So I was a little out of practice. I remember, wandering around my house looking for my passport, and I forgot to pack toiletries. I think I packed for about a week and ended up staying 4. But eventually, I got back into the groove. But similarly, this is only about the second time I've spoken to a large group in quite a while. So I'd like to dial down your expectations appropriately for that. I'd also like to take a moment and thank Regional Chancellor Karen Holbrook. Dr. Holbrook has been on our board of directors for some years. She has provided outstanding service to CRDF Global. She is an extraordinary guide for us and also a great traveling companion. So Karen will always have Petra, where we held our last board meeting before COVID struck was in Jordan. I've got 3 basic categories of remarks for you today. The first includes some big picture observations about the main actors and the states involved in what I think is a really significant tectonic shift in the geopolitical firmament. It is nothing particularly original for those of you who have been following the issue closely, but I'll offer them in truncated form, mainly to provoke some discussion and follow-up. I think that people all up and down the policy line, the lines of policy, oversight, execution, tend to be pretty focused on the immediate operational issues because of the humanitarian aspect and all of the, the pressing issues. Those are highly necessary and understandable, but I think we also need to pay some attention in some circles to the wider and long-term considerations. The second category is also big picture, but it looks a little bit more closely at our own U.S. systems and mechanisms and where they might enjoy a bit of revision. And finally, I'll share a little bit of a travelogue, try to weave some of it into the other areas. I covered a lot of ground in March and April, all along the Polish, Slovakian, Hungarian, Romanian borders with Ukraine, initially just checking out access points and border crossings in case things got horribly, horribly worse and we needed to get all of our 45 staff out of the country quickly. As it is, our 45 Ukrainian staff are mixed. About 29 still remain in country. 11 have, relocated to a satellite office we've set up in Krakow, Poland, and others are in different European cities with friends or family. I visited with Embassy Kyiv in exile. Most of them are living at the Bristol Hotel in Rzeszów, Poland. A small group have gone back into Kyiv at this point. I visited with the troops from the 82nd Airborne, who are also based out near Rzeszów. A ton of NGOs, a bunch of refugees, including some of our own staff, and one of the many CODELs, congressional delegations that has gone out there. I was there when a 10-member Senate delegation came through, and I spent some time with them. So big picture. As I said, I think this is a tectonic shift in the geopolitical firmament. It's a big deal, and the aftershocks will keep coming. Just looking at it through the lens of 4 groups and how they're affected, starting with Putin and Russia and the Russians. I believe Russia will be isolated and shunned by much of the world for a good while. Now, China and India, to name 2 significant countries, did not come out. And there were a number of other countries when the UN General Assembly passed a resolution that either rejected it or abstained. But a great part of the world is looking at this like, what the heck? And I think the recrimination in geopolitical terms will last for a bit. Russia will be poorer and, ironically, less secure thanks to this kinetic intervention in Ukraine. And I think Russians, many of whom would like to believe that their leader has vision and can lead them to great power renewal, will and are slowly waking up to the facts. And there's a difference between rural and urban, with the urban Russians in urban centers being more attuned to what's going on outside the country. And there's a difference generationally with younger people, as in all societies. But even at every age, I think Russians are skeptical of state media and state propaganda. But the younger ones are particularly more resistant and able to seek out different avenues of information. Will Putin last? First of all, there is no, to my knowledge, regime change effort by the U.S., and there shouldn't be. The U.S., Putin should be taken care of by his own country, and anything that we did or the coalition did in that direction would probably backfire. But if you look back to the coup attempts in Russia in 1991 and 1993, there were two, and there were cases of the power ministries getting together, recalibrating their interests, and trying to change things. Now, neither one was successful. The first was against Gorbachev. The second was against Yeltsin. And ironically, U.S. intelligence, in a very limited fashion, worked with the FSB in the second one to try to stave off the ouster of Yeltsin. But it has happened before. It could happen again. And as I said, I think the power ministries in the SVR, the FSB, the GRU, and the security state are looking at their own interest and thinking about what the future might hold. Turning to President Zelensky and Ukraine and the Ukrainians, there is just a huge tidal wave of support in the U.S. and elsewhere, and it remains very, very strong. Part of it is the tenacity and the sympathy we have for a country that has been victimized, but then that kind of classic love of the underdog that turns out to be a lot tougher than the adversary thought. I mean, that's where Ukraine is right now, and it has been dramatically accelerated or intensified by the singular talents of President Zelensky. I mean, it is a real Prince Hal to Henry V kind of story, because when he came in without a political background. He was a writer of television series, of comedy. He was not, particularly he was not particularly well known outside of his entertainment values. But he has shown himself to be an extraordinary communicator. He has won over the parliaments and the congresses of countries around the world. And if you haven't seen it, I would recommend tuning into Netflix. I think it's still on there. And watch all 3 seasons, or pick and choose a few of the episodes of his television show, Servant of the People, which was about an unlikely character who ends up being the president of Ukraine. A real fascinating example of life imitating art, with some very astute and fascinating nuances woven in through the series. But even tidal waves of support do dissipate, and the tide goes out. The $40 billion, the most recent large supplemental appropriation, $40 billion, passed the House and Senate last week. It was signed into law by the president on Saturday. There was a little bit of grumbling. I've also seen some memes that have come out circulating about people wanting to declare Zelensky a dependent on their IRS tax forms. Now, I'm as supportive as anyone of support for Ukraine. I think it is entirely in our interest, and it should be generous and continuing. But even I had to laugh a little bit on that one. That deceleration of goodwill will be faster if there are examples of major corruption or human rights abuses, et cetera, that come to light in the coming months or years. But even without such things, eventually support does wane. I also think the generational effect on Ukraine will be huge. And I haven't seen this written about very much elsewhere. For decades to come, anyone running for office in Ukraine, from dog catcher up to the president, the question will be asked, where were you during the war? I mean, this will be a generational milestone touch point for political activity in the years to come. And as Jody was talking about, looking at the experience of children, and we have a number of children among our staff that I've met and talked to, and some of them are enrolled in schools in Poland. But the children going through this refugee experience and the displacement experience, while of course it is traumatic, and there will be trauma, reverberations from trauma, there's also a likelihood in my mind that the generation coming up who have been exposed to school in Poland and settling in with family or friends in Vienna or traveling, they will be more Europe oriented. They will be more multilingual. They will be more security conscious, and they will probably be a bit more broader minded. So I think in some ways the generation of Ukrainians to come may be stronger and more resilient than they would have been but for this unfortunate invasion. Turning to European Union, NATO, US, and I'm grouping them all together a little bit intentionally. 3 years ago, I just want to remind people, I was on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee after the NATO summit, and there was a communique with 96 points, and the witnesses at our hearing were saying, everything's good. Meanwhile, President Trump was out there saying things that really questioned the value of NATO, and saying they owe us money, and all kinds of things that undercut the basic message of the importance of the NATO alliance. Vladimir Putin has completely obliterated that. I mean, NATO is more unified, stronger than it's ever been. Defense spending is and will be up across the board. And Sweden and Finland are seeking membership. I mean, Finland has a 1,300-mile border with Russia. I mean, it is extraordinary to think of, and it goes exactly what Putin was trying to roll back has actually snapped back on him. The U.S. certainly didn't plan this, but I think that, as with any situation, the current administration will get both the credit and the blame. History won't care, how the administration was, in terms of briefing Nord Stream 2 before the invasion, or being a little tentative about sanctions that they didn't think they could get the Germans on board with. All of that has been washed away by the tidal wave of history. And for what it's worth, I think the response generally has been really quite good, particularly in the accelerated delivery of javelins, stingers, other weapons that would allow Ukraine fighting this asymmetric style of warfare against a much larger and more powerful force to be so effective. I also think it's been very interesting how the administration kind of broke with tradition in rolling out intelligence-derived information and putting it out publicly. Things like, Russian, indications that Russia was going to stage a atrocity of some kind, or a fake chemical weapons thing, as an excuse to invade. I think by putting that information out there, it defused some of the power that could be accrued from a big disinformation or information operation. Different from what has been done in the past, and I think a wise move. As we enter a stalemate status in the war, I think we need to recognize that there's temptation for Putin to do something dramatic that shakes up the board. I haven't read any psychological profiles of him, but I just don't think you can take off the table the possibility of the use of weapons of mass destruction. He was willing to use them, see them used in Syria. And as crazy as it sounds, the chance of his using a tactical nuclear device is not zero. And anything that is not zero is cause for concern. I hope and believe that folks, at the highest levels of our administration have sat around the Situation Room and talked a little bit about, what their response would be in advance to the use of a nuclear weapon or a weapon of mass destruction. At the very least, we will likely see an uptick in the attention to the nuclear nonproliferation and nonproliferation issues generally. The Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference, which has been postponed a couple times, will occur in August, and I think it will have quite a different agenda than it would have had prior to February 2022. And as horrifying and unforgivable the use of a nuke by Russia would be, I still don't see that this would automatically escalate into strategic nuclear exchange. It would, however, put Russia firmly into the North Korea category in terms of isolation and shunning for decades to come. And that also has potentially some very negative consequences, not just for the Russian people themselves. Finally, looking at China is, it's really interesting. If you read the Sweetheart joint communique that was issued by China and Russia just before the invasion, I think it was on the last day or two of the Olympics, the language in it about democracy and governance is positively Orwellian. And it is clear that they're talking about a different worldview of shaking up the post-war international order in ways that are very concerning for liberal democracies. Xi may well have some buyer's remorse about that communique. His partner has certainly not, clothed himself in glory in this invasion or shown a great deal of effectiveness. But maybe on the other hand, Xi is comforted by the fact that he now has Russia in a true subservient position of devotion. China is its only really big friend. China will buy a lot of discounted oil, and they will be able to rely on Russia's support for anything that it wants in the Security Council. I would truly love to read the strategy memo that Xi's advisors have provided him, no doubt, on lessons learned from the Russian invasion. I think one of the points would be don't fall into the temptation of striking a dramatic kinetic blow because you're impatient, particularly when non-kinetic gray zone operations like disinformation, cyber attacks, snipping off pieces of territory that you can take or exert influence in without actually invading. All of those things you see China doing, with its building of islands in the South China Sea, information operations, economic leverage, the debt diplomacy aspects of Belt and Road. I think that this will probably make China a little more careful and a little more patient, but no less intent on its goal of revamping some of the aspects of the international order. Still remaining with the big picture issues, but focusing a bit through the lens of our own U.S. institutional responses, capabilities and mechanisms. When I look at the interagency and our foreign assistance, sometimes I think of Winston Churchill's quote about democracy being the worst form of government, save for all the others that have been tried from time to time. And as I said, I'm impressed with some of the weapon systems deliveries and accelerating that. But there is such a classic temptation, and we're seeing it in the administration. We've seen it in other administrations whenever things get dramatic, Republican and Democrat, where you kind of pull everything in and try to run everything out of the National Security Council in the White House. We have in the State Department, and it's one of our customers, we do our cybersecurity work in Ukraine based on funding from this office. It's called EURACE. It's part of the European Affairs Bureau. It's the assistance coordinator for Europe and Eurasia. And it was created after the fall of the Soviet Union with the intent of having a coordinator for assistance, both security assistance, military assistance, development assistance, having a some kind of coordinator that recognizes their diplomatic and military implications for almost anything you do in the region. We have that office, it exists, they're not using it as a coordinator. It's over in the State Department. I think the temptation is to basically make, in a situation this intense, Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, is like the desk officer. However, they're getting the job done. They've got a coordinator on an NSC task force. They pulled in retired General Terry Wolf to kind of run that, and we'll see how it turns out. I do think that the Ukraine situation currently and also going forward, as we move into some more, perhaps more stabilized reconstruction, I do think that the lanes that we establish for military assistance, international security assistance, development assistance, humanitarian, economic, with the various authorities under Title 10, the military section of the code, or Title 22, the State Department and USAID, I do think that it is hamstringing us a bit in a situation like this. And that we should, as important as it is to have actually, sheer volume of dollars, which we're meeting, $40 billion is nothing to sneeze at, we should also be pushing and seeking some waivers of some of the restrictions on the authorities. Congress is always suspicious of administration requests to waive authorities and congressional notifications. That's why it really needs to be their idea. And I would lean hard on the Senate and House leadership and, people of goodwill, national security conscious people from both parties. If I were in the administration now, and say, look, let's make sure that if we are going to use U.S. taxpayer dollars, we can make them as flexible as possible to use them where they're needed, when they're needed. Soldier diplomacy. As I mentioned, I was in Rzeszów. We have about 1,000, maybe 1,500 folks from the 82nd Airborne deployed there. They're occupying an arena, kind of an indoor arena. They've got their bunks all set up, and they're not only a tripwire. They've got some serious capability, that they've got with them, but they are mainly, I would say, a tripwire and a reassurance for Poland. But what I wanted to remark on when I say soldier diplomacy, the commander of the 82nd Task Force there, Brigadier General, started up a daily community of interest meeting every morning at 10 a.m. at the arena, the G2A arena, and everybody was invited. There were folks from the bilateral representatives from various countries, including as far away as Australia and New Zealand. There were all of the UN agencies represented, folks from the embassy, from USAID, from the US Embassy in Poland, the Polish border guys, and NGOs. And what it did was, they hosted it, the Brigadier hosted it, and the 82nd hosted it, but they were basically creating a forum for people to interact and to feel like they were heard as well as given a chance to identify issues. And I think it was really an impressive display of military stepping a little bit out of its traditional lane and doing something that kept that coalition, has helped keep that coalition together. I don't think they teach that at Command and General Staff College, but hoorah for the 82nd. Let's assume that there's plenty of money for reconstruction. Not only what we and the European Union putting up, but also potentially drawing on the billions of Russian assets that remain frozen in various international banks. What do we want to do with it and why? And who's doing the analysis that can look at, look, where Ukraine was pre-invasion, I mean, I think it was 129th out of all countries on the Global Innovation Index for infrastructure. Infrastructure for laboratories, for research, for manufacturing, that kind of thing. By contrast, it was way up like second of all countries in terms of the number of women with advanced degrees working in the workforce. So that's a strength. Now that strength has been affected by displacement and women, in the workforce leaving the country with dependents in tow, interrupting their studies, interrupting their work and so forth. But on the infrastructure side, doing an analysis of what infrastructure should be rebuilt, what elements should be simply set aside as not a priority, thinking about it in terms of the international global supply chains, things that matter to us. Ukraine is a producer of neon. Neon is important in chip manufacturing. Ukraine has one of the private companies has a new process for titanium, getting the raw material of titanium into alloys. I mean, those are just a couple examples. There are legion, but I'm still looking for the kind of overall analysis of what you would rebuild and why. A final note on the kind of institutional, big picture institutional. We cannot build and sustain long-term alliances on crucial issues that go to the international order, things that we can't do by ourselves, the US or any individual power. We, the US, cannot lead or sustain those things if our policies are dramatically veering off in different directions every 2, 4, or 6 years based on our congressional, presidential, and senatorial election cycles. I mean, our division, our red state, blue states, the dynamic we're in right now, and we're not alone. You see it in the UK with Brexit, you see it in lots of places, but that kind of dynamic, if you can't keep that from bleeding over into across the water's edge, into foreign policy and national security issues, we will not be able to do what is necessary to combat the goal that China and Russia have to change the international order to one that is more authoritarian, less supportive of Western liberal democratic norms. So I don't know how to fix that, but I think it is worth saying, and I say it every time I can, whether it's talking on the Hill or to folks in an audience like this. I promised you a bit of travelogue. First, for someone who is used to treks across the eastern desert of Jordan or through the marshlands of South Sudan, getting around Eastern Europe is such a breeze. I mean, I rented a car in Warsaw and I did my best to wear the tires off it. The road, rail, and communication and general infrastructure available to the countries bordering Ukraine, and to a large extent, even still, Ukraine itself, is just outstanding. And it shows not only in the various efforts, both official and individual, to support Ukraine, but also in the manner in which the border countries have accommodated Ukrainian refugees. Of the 6 or 7 border crossings I went to, they were distinct in flavor. The one in Medyka, Poland, was a little bit like it felt a little bit like Burning Man. There were these tents set up and all these people were, but there was still a somewhat of a coordinating function. The ones in Hungary were particularly well run and organized. They were kind of under the overarching mandate of the Knights of Malta, with a lot of different groups providing support. But the thing I want to highlight, and I think it builds a bit on what Jody was talking about, is they're all using an approach that is different from my experience of refugees coming out of Syria or coming out of Sudan into remote regions. What I would call it the concierge approach, because the refugees are coming over. The first thing, if somebody gets across the border, might be a woman, a couple of kids in tow. They ask the question, do you have a plan? Do you have a plan, and how can we help you execute that plan? If the answer is yes, I've got family in Vienna, I want to get to Vienna. Okay, we're going to help you get to Vienna. We're going to make sure you have your basic needs are met, but but that's your plan, and we're going to work on that for you to execute your plan. If the answer is, I'm just putting one foot in front of the other, I don't have a plan, that's fine. Let's go over here. Let's get you, fed, warmed up. There's a safe place to stay. We'll help you figure out what your options are. This works in an environment of what I refer to as the smartphone refugees. In one of the photos that Jody had in her excellent presentation, there was a picture of refugees crossing the border. It looked like it might have been Medica. But one of them was on the phone, which is really typical. I mean, you see the refugees coming across, they've got phones, they've got communications, they've got some agency that other refugees don't have. And I was very impressed by the way in which the various, support agencies kind of figured this out. They didn't just try to set up camps. They were basically like good concierges, helping people, progress into a place where they could get a little bit of, settled down. And that included providing, free transportation all over Europe. This obviously would not work in Maban, South Sudan, or out by Tower 22 on the Jordan-Syrian border, but it works here, and it's a great sign of adaptation. Observation, people are great. The genuine outpouring of assistance from every quarter of the border countries, societies is heartwarming. As I said earlier, I think the kids who will be shaped even by these traumatic events will, in many cases, be not only okay, but in some ways better. But at the same time, somehow, people are awful. My last weekend in Poland, I went out to Auschwitz-Birkenau, and we need to heed the words carved in about 20 languages on the monument at Birkenau. Forever let this place be a cry of despair and a warning to humanity. I think Putin's gambit in Ukraine and the big lies and the information operation efforts accompanying it are awfully reminiscent of pre-war Nazi Germany, and which is ironic given that his campaign is a denazification justification. But indeed, we must never forget, always prepare for the worst while looking for and recognizing the best in humanity. And I think it's very appropriate for, I think the next segment of your conference series is on disinformation. Disinformation is annoying when it's about little things, but the real danger is the big lie that kind of justifies extraordinary, atrocious events. I congratulate you all. Thank you, Karen, for inviting me. I congratulate you all on this multi-part conference and on your own commitment to knowledge and truth and the human spirit. I hope my remarks have been helpful.
Well, Tom, thank you very much for a brilliant discussion. Very insightful. I really appreciate the tectonic shift that you're talking about. And I think that's going to be two ways, not just on the citizens of the Ukraine, but also on the citizens of Europe and the rest of the world. As we see these, I'll call them displaced persons versus refugees at this time, as they immigrate elsewhere, they're going to take their languages, their customs and everything, and they'll assimilate and pick up others. So I think that's very interesting. As a military man, I truly appreciate your thoughts on the 2- and 4-year cycle. The lack of budgets, the lack of strategy, the lack of planning by Congress and administrations jerks us around just as badly as it does the international world. We do have a couple of questions. So first, General Breedlove talked about a fast-track assimilation of Finland and Sweden into NATO, and I think we're seeing that. Can you talk a little bit about the impacts of Turkey and their objections right now and where that's heading?
Yeah, no, I mean, if it were a case of trading Turkey for Finland and Sweden, if it were baseball trades, I'd take it. But, look, geography matters, and Turkey's geography is nothing to be given up easily. It's like Erdogan, the leader of Turkey, he came and he definitely has demonstrated in a number of ways an inkling to the more authoritarian kind of tendencies and style of, of a Putin and a Xi and, the Chinese models. But look, when I was in the Senate, most recently, the big issue was Turkey's purchase of the Russian anti-air defense systems. And those air defense systems, the most sophisticated ones that Russia sells, have a way of kind of tracking and ingesting data about, advanced aircraft that was very problematic for, the F-35, the F-22, other advanced aircraft that we fly. And I think we made it about as clear as possible at the technical level with the Turks, as well as at the political level with, members of Congress and Senate, the administration saying, guys, don't do this. Even to the point where, people explored what are the processes for, kicking someone out of NATO. And the short answer to that is, they never made a process for that. So I think Turkey will, Turkey, Erdogan represents his sovereign interests, his personal interests, and he is, I'm not a U.S. official. I can say what I want. Erdogan has a lot of money in the bank, just like Putin does, from various means. So, I'm not quite sure where Turkey's interest begins and ends and Erdogan's personal interests begin and end. But at the end of the day, I think his objections will be overcome, and both Finland and Sweden are on a very fast track for acceptance. Their applications are in. I think we'll be looking at weeks or months, not years.
Right. And then a quick follow-up, if I may. General Breedlove made note that Putin had threatened Finland and Sweden if they were to join. Do you see that coming, or you think he's going to retreat from that statement?
Well, no. I mean, look, I'm not an expert on the history of Finland, but I from what I understand of it, and Finlandization, at one point, during the Soviet era, became a bit of a derogatory reference to, a country that kind of rolled over on its back, for a powerful neighbor. I look at it as, at the time, Finland's leaders figured out a way to live with a 1,300-mile border with the Soviet Union and keep a level of autonomy and independence. And they did what they had to do to stay an independent sovereign nation, with a Soviet Union on the border. I don't think they liked it, but they did it, and I congratulate them on doing that. Now, they're looking at the situation and saying, you know what, we might not have to live with this anymore. Yeah. We can actually join NATO and have that entire coalition at our back. So I think that it's not something they're undertaking lightly. And they've shown themselves, historically to be very astute in terms of managing, the realities of geography. But they're even without the NATO membership, they've been living with, it's part of Russian doctrine to use, to have low yield nukes and deploy them along their borders, including their border with Finland. So Finland and just next door Sweden are very concerned about the doctrine of the use of tactical nuclear weapons, because they would be the first line.
Right. Okay. So looking into your crystal ball, post-war or post-Putin, how does Russia rejoin the world?
I think it's a great question, and as much as I am, I think it's atrocious what Russia has done. I think to the story of Weimar Germany. You don't want a situation of Russia. Russia was already demographically in decline. It's an aging population. It's not a particularly healthy population. Its biggest asset is its energy resources, and its energy resources are now being barred from, and its main customers are finding alternatives. I don't think that it's in our long-term interest, and particularly in a Russia without Putin, if it's a Russia without a leader that comes straight out of the security, the FSB tradition, KGB, then FSB. I don't think it's in anyone's interest to have a completely weak and entirely discouraged Russia over the long term. So they've got to, they're not. Ukraine is if they stay in Ukraine, even in some kind of a stalemate, I think Ukraine has gotten a taste for insurgency operations, and Ukrainian citizens will continue to fight. So they've got maybe not Crimea. Maybe Crimea they leave off because Ukraine only had it for 70 or 80 years. But maybe I think at some point we have to think about what would it take for Russia, who is still a permanent member of the UN Security Council and a nuclear power, to be brought back a little more into the international community. But as I said, for right now, I think for the next foreseeable future, they will be shunned, and they are doing everything they're doing is putting them more into the category of a North Korea than a permanent member of the Security Council.
Yeah. Well, Tom, thanks again for your time, your insights, your experiences, and your expertise in sharing it with us today. We truly appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me. Great to be with you.
Thank you. Okay, at this time, we're going to turn it over to the Director of Communications for University of South Florida and Sarasota Manatee Campus, Mr. Bill Hampton, who will introduce our next speaker.
Sylvain Charlebois is a Canadian researcher and professor in food distribution and food supply at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. He's also the senior director of the Agri-Food Analytics Lab, also located at Dalhousie. He is renowned for his work in agricultural and food policy, has published over 500 peer-reviewed articles, and authored 5 books on global food systems. Known as a food professor, his current research interest lies in the broad area of food distribution, security, and safety. He is one of the world's most cited scholars in food supply chain management, food value chains, and traceability. Please welcome to our series, Dr. Sylvain Charlebois. Dr. Charlebois, thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome to the Ukraine What's Next series.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation.
Great, thanks for being here. So let's start off with an overview of the current state of the world food supply. And I'm assuming it was already challenged in the face of an ongoing global pandemic. Now, where are we?
Right now, we're seeing the evolution of the perfect playbook for a global food security crisis, really. And of course, climate or climate change is the constant denominator. Doesn't matter when it's affecting our capacity to produce food anywhere around the world. And last year in 2021 was a really bad year for crops in the northern hemisphere. We saw droughts in Canada, parts of the US, in Russia. There were floods in Germany. So we really started the year 2022 in a really bad position. Inventories were very low. Then, of course, we had the pandemic. The pandemic basically weakened global supply chains all over the world. And what really happened with variants and the pandemic is that the global economy is not in sync anymore. The virus or variants impacted different economies at different times in different ways due to the virus itself, of course, and measures implemented by different agencies and governments, which is why logistically it was very difficult to move anything around. Commodities, finished products, semi-finished products. So that's why we've seen delays, and of course with labor, people getting sick. It's been very challenging to forecast, predict, plan. Whether you're moving stuff on water or on land. It's been very difficult, and that's why it's costing more to move anything. But it really has increased the amount of food waste as well across the supply chain. So we're getting less food at destination, no matter where you're going. The third element is the war, the invasion. So in February, Russia decided to invade Ukraine, which really started a new cycle, inflation cycle. But most importantly, the conflict is really impacting an important agricultural hub. That area is critical to the world. About 30% of all grains exported come from that area. And so once we saw the invasion occurring, I think most people knew that we were going to look at major deficits for wheat, barley, corn, sunflower, many commodities. And of course, that region doesn't require a whole lot of fertilizers either because you got a lot of black soil there. But Canadian farmers, American farmers do buy a lot of fertilizers from that area, from China as well. But now with trade disruptions, it's been very difficult. And fertilizers, as you probably spoke about in your earlier seminars, fertilizers are incredibly expensive. So that's the third element of the playbook. The last one, which is unfolding right now, is what I would call nationalistic protectionism. So you're seeing more nations panicking and frankly hoarding. So we saw that this week with India and wheat. And a couple of weeks ago, it was with Indonesia and palm oil. And so every time you see a call like that occur, you see commodity prices go up again. So a bushel of wheat went up 6% this week. With vegetable oil a few weeks ago, same thing. So it basically brings less food and that to the market, and that food is becoming more and more expensive.
Let's talk a little bit about what's happening at the ports and the movement of food. The executive director of the World Food Program has said, quote, "A failure to open closed ports in Ukraine to ship grains out will bring millions of people to the brink of starvation." And I think he went further, and this was in a meeting, I believe, with Secretary of State Blinken there. Failure to open the ports will be a declaration of war on global food security, resulting in famine, destabilization of nations, as well as mass migration by necessity. You can speak a little bit about that reality or his statement there.
Yeah, so the FAO made that statement with the World Food Program, and by the way, Ukraine provides 9% of the volume of grains to the World Food Program every year. So that's significant. It's a huge deficit. The World Bank also said something similar, by the way. I think it was a couple of days later. So I absolutely concur with both the World Bank and the World Food Program. Unfortunately, numbers are in the hundreds of millions of more people suffering from hunger, likely over the next little while. Famine will hit many regions of the world. And when I think about some of the regions, I would include probably Northeast Africa, parts of the Middle East, parts of Europe, parts of Asia as well. North America is in this sort of food security bubble, really. And when I look at policies coming from both Washington and Ottawa, you can see that really there's little recognition of what's actually is going on around the world. It's I mean, this situation is pretty dire, and President Biden actually extended the ethanol mandate a few weeks ago, which really again shows that the food to fuel debate is back, and you kind of wonder, why are we sacrificing more acreage growing food to support our biofuel agenda right now specifically. So that's one thing. And in Canada, I would say the same thing. In Canada, Ottawa is not necessarily looking at helping farmers to grow more of the crops we need this year at all. It's looking at the green agenda with carbon sequestration, which is fine at any given year, but really this year we need more productivity coming from farmers as much as possible. But you can see that there is a bubble in North America which doesn't necessarily allow citizens here to really recognize what is really going on elsewhere around the world.
I think that's a great segue to something I want to ask you next, which is, what specifically is happening in the agricultural regions in Ukraine? What's it like for those farmers? Are they missing out on a whole planting season, growing season? Speak a little bit about what the reality is there.
Well, reports right now aren't clear. Obviously, it's a war zone. What we're hearing so far is that there is some ag resiliency, if you will. There are some farmers putting seeds in the ground, which is reassuring. But at the end of the day, we're not expecting the same output this year out of the Ukraine, and so that's why there's a lot of skepticism. Now, Russia, of course, will be producing, but due to sanctions, we're wondering what's going to happen. And China is the wild card in all of this. We don't know exactly what China intends to do. I don't think anybody knows. If someone claims to know, it's probably based on the wrong information. So it's right now, I think the world markets have priced in zero output coming from Ukraine this year. That's what I'm seeing right now. Because a bushel of wheat at $12.50 US. It's insanely high. It's an historical high, and other commodities are trading at very high levels as well.
Unprecedented situation. So the UN is also estimating around 20 million tons of grain are currently stuck in Ukraine from the previous harvests. If released, obviously that could ease pressure on the markets. Do you have any angles on how this could be accomplished?
As long as you have access, the reserves are there. It's access that's the problem. And so that's the big deal right now, I would say. So, of course, many countries, including the United States and Canada, are looking into reserves and see what can be achieved in order to lessen the pressure that is being put on markets right now. So yeah, I mean the Southern Hemisphere had a good year overall in terms of production, but it's not going to be enough to offset all of the deficit that we're expecting by the end of our 90-day cycle, which ends in September and October.
Yeah. So I think as we wrap this up, what are the long-term impacts, and what can be done? Maybe this is more of a short-term thing. What can be done by other nations to increase supply in the short term? And what does this long-term impact mean? We have no idea when the conflict will end, but thoughts.
Well, obviously, the best case scenario would be to end the conflict, but the conflict really has led to a missed production cycle. We're almost into June now, and so we've just missed a cycle. At the end of the day, I think we need to define what globalization 2.0 actually looks like, and I think by dismissing some of the nations that aren't necessarily valuing humanitarian values would have to prevail, and I would think of Russia. I mean, what Russia has done is unexcusable, and so I think that moving forward, I think we need to really look at who's in and who's out from a global perspective. My concern, to be honest, right now, is that more and more nations, there's more rhetoric around deglobalization. And that would actually make things even worse, in my view. Localizing food markets will only lead to higher prices and more food insecurity. And so I certainly would encourage anyone to debate this. It's an important issue, but I actually do believe that trades actually make the world more food secure, not less. And this is what is at stake right now. So I do hope that trades will prevail, but with nations willing to uphold humanitarian values.
Thank you so much, Professor Charlebois. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for all of the research, the great research you're doing there in your laboratories, and look forward to talking to you again soon. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. You take care.
Thank you.
Okay, that was most enlightening to say the least. It's easy to sit here and speculate and wonder, with the food crisis that's going on, and that's not going to be a short-term fix. Now you throw in it the Russians not blockading, but stopping the export of fuel and gas to Finland and others, and European countries blockading the import. What's going to happen this winter as folks are trying to heat their homes? You got all these immigrants that are relocating, and there's lack of food supply. We're looking at a really interesting year in front of us, I predict. At this time, we're going to start our panel discussion, and we're very fortunate today. We've got three very prominent folks to discuss what's going on in the Ukraine. The first is a Dr. Nicholas Crowley, who spent 3 years working in Ukraine for the British military preparing for the Russian invasion. Secondly, a Dr. Nasa Holmes from International Human Trafficking Fundraising and a USF graduate. And last, Dustin Osberg, a retired Marine Special Operations expert who is currently an explosive expert for Battelle, and he just recently returned from Kyiv, where he trained Ukrainian Special Forces. I'd like each of you to spend a few minutes talking about your background and then about your experiences with the Ukraine. And Dr. Crowley, we'll start with you, please.
Hey, thank you very much. I appreciate the chance to be here. I work as a civilian advisor to the military, the U.S., the U.K., and our partners abroad, the Iraqis, the Nigerians, the Ukrainians. And the focus is on how military forces understand societies in which conflict takes place, to include when it's in your own borders. So I work with the Ukrainians over the past several years to develop these capabilities that work along sort of the civil-military divide. What do the armed forces of Ukraine have to understand about, fault lines in Ukrainian society, the ways in which the Russians might try to take advantage of that? And the same sort of proposition, how do the Iraqis understand the ways in which, say, the Islamic State is trying to take advantage of fault lines in their society? And so that kind of work has given me insight into the civil military landscape in Ukraine, obviously into those fault lines themselves, the fundamentals of sort of civil society as it relates to the conflict. So that's the perspective I'm coming from. I don't position myself as a Ukraine expert per se. I went there, at the behest of the British government in this instance, to give the Ukrainians kind of process and method and structure to do that kind of work, which in turn, again, gives access to the armed forces, to the NGO landscape, both internationally and domestically in Ukraine, and again, the fundamentals of society itself. So I'll be speaking from that point of view. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Dustin, your thoughts?
My background is just, I did 20 years in Marine Corps, Marine Raiders, retired, and now I'm just helping out with wherever I can help out with any type of training that's needed across the board. We just got lucky and flew in and met up with some very, very friendly and great people in Ukraine. So we spent 3 weeks there doing that.
All right, thank you. And Dr. Holmes?
First of all, thank you very much. Yes, I am a graduate from USF. So go Bulls. I have a doctorate degree where I've been so fortunate. I've worked for the government, our United States government. I've been able to work in 31 different countries around the world. My first exposure to the human trafficking was actually in Vienna, where I did a presentation and also worked for the refugees from Syria, when there were 15,000 refugees on the streets. And now I've been brought back into an NGO called Mindful Hearts of Atlanta, where we are servicing the refugees that are coming across the border from Ukraine, Poland specific, et cetera. So I'm very, very thrilled to be here today to assist, to also, contribute to this. It's catastrophic. To watch it on TV, it's catastrophic to see what's going on, to know what's happening to the women and the children that are innocent people living in a war zone, and they're being snagged at train stations, on the streets to be used as human traffic, whether it's agricultural or sex trafficking. And so it's a true honor for me to be a part of this. And I thank you very much for putting me on this today.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I want to start with boots on the ground, okay? Because I think it's very interesting. We've got two panelists here that have actually spent time working with the Ukrainian military. How receptive were they to you coming in and offering advice? They know that they had a potential calamity on hand. What was it like when you first got over there, and what was your overall experience? And Doctor, we'll start with you, please.
Sure. I mean, again, my engagement goes back to 2020, where, again, we think of this, we're tempted to think of this as something that started a couple months ago, but Russia and Ukraine have been at war for years, right? That's the perspective of the Ukrainians, and certainly within the armed forces, where the folks there in uniform have been at this, rotating through the front in the east, for years and years. So this is an escalation, certainly. But having been through what they've been through and the experience that they have, there's what I found a really interesting balance between confidence, appropriately placed self-confidence in their ability to deal with what they've dealt with, get interest in outside ideas that fit into how they do what they do, right? So this is sort of a post-Soviet military, structurally, organizationally, logistically, a lot of that legacy is still there. And having looked at some of the high-level engagement from the U.S., from the UK, from NATO, there's been tension, not in a negative way, but in like a just pure friction kind of way of how do we become, we as the Ukrainians, sort of a more modern, Western, interoperable force. And to what extent can we take, a NATO doctrinal template and run with it? Do we want to? I think the short answer to that is sort of sometimes when it suits us, right? And, it's been interesting that in the last sort of several months, still being in touch with the people that I've worked with, there's more and more, again, confidence with the way things have gone, particularly in the soft community, where, they feel, I think rightly so, like they have some things to teach. It's not just a one-way flow of information. So again, I found them a great partner for us to work with. Their civil military capabilities were really created out of thin air in 2014 in response to the crisis. Civil affairs and CIMIC weren't key features of the Soviet era structures, right? And they hadn't been really developed before then. But they get it, they run with it. And, when the war's in your own country, you can't walk away from the fact, you can't ignore the fact that the line blurs between what's military and what's civilian. And, militaries have to understand this kind of stuff. And so, the learning curve has been steep. I've been really impressed and really enjoyed the back and forth. Thank you.
Okay. Dustin?
I'll 100% back that. The first thing that anybody ever pointed out when we got there was this isn't a new war. It's been going on for years. We've been fighting it for years. We're excited that you're here. I've had a range of levels of individuals to teach. I've had teachers and farmers that just joined the fight, and they were there and showing up in tennis shoes and wondering what they could get or what they needed to learn. And we're teaching them how to load a weapon and how to BZO a weapon. And then I've had the special forces guys coming in, and they're all very eager and just very open-minded to whatever information we're giving. We had the sit-down talks where they're asking me about booby traps and mines and what happens if they invade their house or whatever. And I had to give them the harsh reality that I've never been invaded. I've only been an invader when it comes down to it. And so I'm learning from them just as much as they're learning from me. And as long as anybody goes into it with that thought process, this isn't like, I don't think there's a classroom out there that a teacher will say that they're not going to learn something from their students. At some point, you're going to learn something from everybody. And if you're not, then you should stop, because you're no longer accepting to what's out there. Learning from them was amazing, which is 100% why I'm working on going back.
So I was talking with a historian the other day, and two observations that this individual made. Number one, he said, the war to compare this one to is probably the American Revolutionary War, where you had citizens take arms against an organized militia. And I think that's very much what we're seeing over in the Ukraine today. And then the other comment that I thought was interesting was the Russian style of military action is very comparable to Sherman's march on Atlanta, where it's just slash and burn, destroy, no precision, no care about what targets are hitting or anything else. Thoughts on those two comments?
I mean, I saw mind you, I was there towards the end of March into April. So Kyiv was shut down. Lviv was taking as many people in as they can, and the borders were just swamped with people trying to come across. Mm-hmm. But I saw firsthand there's no strategic plan for where the missiles were landing. They hit one of the big shopping malls, which killed a reporter right outside. They were just lobbing rounds wherever they could. And like, it seemed like chaos coming from the Russian side. And so they were trying to meet with chaos. You can't dictate what chaos is going to do. So they're trying to figure out what their next play is. And the way they're doing it is pretty brilliant.
Yeah. Okay. Dr. Holmes, not necessarily human trafficking per se, but there has been reports of a large number of Ukrainian citizens that were exported, if you will, into Russia. That's a form of trafficking, I guess. Do you think we'll ever see those folks again? You think there's any way that there's a organized effort of NGOs or whatever to try and get those folks back?
I'm going to say no. Since 2006, various programs have been put into place to try and prevent trafficking all along, whether it's agricultural, whether they're taking young men to go work in the farm fields, or they're taking women for sewing, et cetera. We've seen that. They've disappeared into Russia, Poland, Czech, Turkey, Austria for a very long time. And the U.S. State Department has an office of monitoring and combating trafficking for persons, and they've tiered each one of the countries around the world. And right now, if you look at the bordering countries, including Russia, they're a tier 2W or 3, meaning that they have nothing in place to combat this at all. So they're trying to take measures, and they've been working on it for quite some time. The problem is they've put out the literature for it, but they've not put any preventative measure in place. So now it's trying to prevent it before it happens. So the folks that are gone now, it's a matter of if someone goes in, finds them, they can release them on, their own activities. However, we can stop it at the border because we see what's going on to prevent further victims, further folks from going over there and getting trapped into it. Yes, they're disappearing by large amounts of people. Are we ever going to get them back? Probably not, unless something happens to where military or whoever goes in, but you know how that works. So I'm going to say the answer is no. And all we can do is just hope that one day it stops. It's a problem worldwide. It's not just what's going on there. It's a problem.
Right. A follow-up to that, is it possible to vet volunteers during a refugee crisis to ensure the safety of the refugees, and in particular the children?
Yes. As a matter of fact, there's different steps that you can take to prevent that. When you're providing security, logistics, support for any type of refugee, wherever they're coming from, travel support, you have to have vehicles that transport them from the second they cross the border to safe housing. We have to secure them. So it takes manpower. It takes a lot of people. It takes a lot of money to do this every day. The cost is about $2,500 a day just to do one safe house, just to move 12 people, just to have food, water, et cetera, to move these folks to a temporary location for about 48 hours. And then you move them on to the next, stop point to where we can move them to where they want to go. The children is definitely a problem right now, and the women. And all you can do is have as many eyes at that area crossing to see what's going on so that we can protect them.
Right. Okay, thank you. I think most folks would say that the Russians have underachieved and the Ukrainians have overachieved militarily right now. Dr. Crowley, would you make an observation, a comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a question of what your benchmark is. You know, a sort of personal accountability, right? We're all asked to make predictions on these things. And I was sitting in Kiev maybe 10 days before the invasion, more or less convinced this wasn't going to happen, right? And I based that on a couple observations. You know, one was having worked with the Ukrainians, you know, for not years and years, but long enough to see that these folks are going to fight. Yes, there are corruption issues. Yes, there are logistical issues. Yes, a lot of the concerns raised about the transition from that kind of post-Soviet organization are real, but there's a will to fight here. And you know, you watch the press about, oh, you know, they're going to take Kiev in 48 hours or 72 hours. That was patently, from my perspective, nonsense. And surely, you know, for the Russian government, you know, they were getting what they wanted by posturing on the border. They made Europe look weak and disorganized. The EU had nothing even remotely approaching a consensus. Put the whole sort of Putin the mastermind narrative was playing out. You know, you'd be crazy to screw that up. Why break that? Why invade? And finally, you know, with all the criticism that was levied at the Ukrainians and the skepticism over how they performed, why did we think the Russians were any better, who hadn't even made that kind of attempt to transition away from the old systems in a lot of respects? So the facts on the ground spoke incredibly strongly to this war not happening. And I held firm in that opinion until Putin's speech just before the invasion, when it was clear he was living in a different world than I was. He had a fundamentally different perspective on this, a different narrative around it. And he was being told things much different from what I was seeing. So, I mean, and the Ukrainians overperformed, maybe. But again, that's a comparative statement, you know, based on what? Based on our assessment of them being not very good. Yeah, they've overperformed. But if you'd spent the last several years working with them, you know, they were actually, there was talent, there was initiative, there's organization, there's a will to fight, and they're going to do that. And conversely, you know, the sort of national security establishment, let's say in DC and elsewhere, have spent a long time hyping up Russian capabilities, from hybrid warfare to the kinetic actions to the, you know, the battle groups they're developing to Wagner. How real is it? You know, looking at Wagner across Central Africa, North Africa, the Middle East, I haven't seen that string of success we ought to have been scared of. If the value proposition is sort of war crimes and policing up after kinetic action, oh, okay, they're formidable, right? But how hard is that? So I think that the way I'd see the question or reframe the question would be like, this war has shown us who these folks really were all along. And it's shined a light on a lot that Ukraine has achieved and a lot of smoke and mirrors, frankly, around Russian capabilities and the hype that's been put up there. Over.
Okay. And Dustin, have the Ukrainians overachieved or the Russians underachieved or a combination of both?
I think it's a combination of both. I think the Russians thought it was going to be a pushover and that the Ukrainians were just going to fold up and walk away. And I think they bit off more than they can chew and realized that little dog's got to fight him. I've seen some of the warehouses they've turned into like bunkers and facilities just to make whatever they need. They're producing anything you can think of right now that could be needed in war. They're producing it, and they're going as far as the people that are producing it are living in the warehouse doing it. They're not going home to comforts, because if they don't produce it, they may not have a home. So they're willing to give up what little comfort they have to help do what they need to secure the country or win whatever they can. I've gone as far as seeing a father having his 15-year-old son be a spotter as a sniper, and they're loading their rounds for multiple calibers right there in their apartment and going out. And you don't see that. Russia doesn't see that on the inside. And I think part of Russia's win with this, or making the Russians believe they're winning, is they're lacking, or they're shutting down the information that's coming in. So they're not really seeing the whole truth of everything. They're only seeing the parts that they want. They're doing an information war, which is why, if anybody's supporting it, that's why they're doing it, is because they're not seeing the full support. They're not seeing the heinous crimes that are happening or that. So I think Russia is underperformed 100%. And I think Ukraine's knocking out the park right now. And I hope they keep doing it.
General Breedlove, in our opening session, was talking about how the Russian generals and colonels came in with 3 days of supplies and their dress uniforms, expecting the Ukrainians to open their arms and throw a parade and celebrations for them. I think that has not been the case, to say the least. And you've proven, as you were saying there, Dustin, when you're fighting for your homeland, it's a totally different scenario. And when you see these citizens come out and do what you were describing there, it shows just how bad the intel was on the Russian side. Okay, there have been talks of the Ukraine accepting neutrality of some degree. And Dr. Holmes, this is for you. If that was to happen, what would humanitarian efforts look like at that point, if there's some sort of neutrality where the eastern part of Ukraine and the southern part was carved up to Russia, for example?
It's still a battle. Like I said, if you look at statistics and you look at the numbers coming out from our State Department, it still shows that there's issues. There's always going to be that battle. There's people that are there, just like we see in any other country. There's problems. So it's hard to remove that evil that sits there. It's hard to remove that. So when we say neutral and we say we all want to work together, that's fine and dandy. However, certain people come in and they go, we're not going to allow you to do the good thing. We're going to go against you. We're going to still continue to do those things. So moving those people around, they're not going to let them move back in. They're not going to let Ukraine work in a humanist fashion. It's a fight. It's a fight. It's a fight for evil. Just like Dustin said a few minutes ago, they're fighting hard. And it's a fight against, humanitarian everything. It's very sad to see. But to say that we're going to work together and that it's going to become a neutral area, I'm going to have to say it's going to be almost impossible to do, because until you remove that evil out of those areas, you're not going to have the peace that they're looking for. You're just not.
Right. So we had a question earlier this morning about adoptions. We're seeing millions of displaced women and children. There's children out there that will never see their fathers, their brothers, their granddads, uncles ever again. They're just the nature of it. Is there an international effort to help with these orphans that are out there now, trying to get them placed into homes?
The problem is guardianship, with the international laws, et cetera. There's tons of people out there that would love to adopt. There's tons of children out there. I'm sure the folks that have been boots on the ground, you've seen the orphanages. You've seen all the children that were without parents. We've seen the nurseries where there were surrogate mothers giving birth to American children. And so parents in America can't even get their children that they used a surrogate for, because the babies are sitting in these different nurseries and hospitals, et cetera. I wish that we could move it faster. I wish that we could find relief for those children. But right now, with their international adoption rules and laws, it's almost impossible, especially with what's going on, where there is no signature. There's no person that can say, hey, yes, I agree to this. This person is going to now raise my child for the rest of their life. So until we can come up with some kind of, and I'm not even sure how they're going to do it, to be honest with you. I don't know how they're going to fix this unless they're temporary, or they do it sort of like how we do it in the States, to where there's fosters, until we can find the parent, find out if they're alive. Did they die in the war? Where are they? It's a major problem. It's a major problem, to fix.
Yeah, unintended consequences, to say the least. And the international impact is going to be huge on that. And the personal impact is really going to be heartbreaking if we're not careful as we work through this.
That's right.
So I want to go back to this Ukraine potentially accepting some sort of neutrality. Dr. Holmes talked about the humanitarian efforts. What would a military effort look like if we were to carve off part of the Ukraine, the eastern part, and the southern ports and everything? Dustin, what's your thinking on that? Would they ever do it, number one? The Ukrainians ever accept that? And if so, what would a military of the future look like in the Ukraine?
I don't think they'd do it. Everybody that I've talked to, they're not about that. They don't. The Ukrainian people that are fighting right now, they don't see a reason why they should have to change anything for Russia. Like they've been fighting and winning. They're in the trenches right now. Why are they going to give up and just say, you know what? Yeah, we'll give you half of our country or whatever. They're not for it. I don't even see it going that way.
Yeah. Okay, Doctor.
Yeah, I'd agree completely. I mean, if anything, it's the opposite. There's this push to take the fight to Russia, whether not necessarily going into Russia per se, but pushing back into areas previously occupied, reclaiming areas of the south and the east. And I think the idea that the West writ large is going to come in and broker a deal where we offer up part of Ukraine to Russia. There's no way the Ukrainians are going to go for that, nor are we in a position to ask for it. And I think that, whether it's DC or London or Brussels, it'd be very dangerous to overestimate the gratitude that we should expect from the Ukrainians. And there's a sentiment of, the West is confronting Russia and they'll fight to the last Ukrainian, to preserve our geopolitical interests. There is real frustration there. There's real frustration around there not being a no-fly zone, for example. Where is the West militarily? And from our perspective outside that country, you can make a cost-benefit analysis and say, yeah, it's not worth the escalation. But if you're a Ukrainian, again, in the trenches fighting this war, the broader geopolitical landscape is a distant second concern to winning the fight right here, right now. So again, I don't see a deal getting made here. I don't see the West having the authority to push it, or any Ukrainian leader with the political capital to accept it and concede terrain. President Zelensky has done very, very well presenting the case of Ukraine during this conflict, but he wasn't particularly popular 6 months ago, 4 months ago. Let's not pretend that he's been the figurehead of Ukraine for years or even more than a couple of months. His reelection was extremely questionable in terms of when the next elections come, where's his party going? We can't conflate patriotism and nationalism and unity among Ukrainians with any kind of coherent political stability behind that. That pivot hasn't been made. And, who are we to say that anyway? I'm not sure we have that here, as some of the earlier comments stated. Thank you.
Right. President Zelensky has said not 1 inch. And I think, if anything, the resolve of the Ukrainian people is strengthened and intensified as they've watched their cities and towns be destroyed, their folks exported against their will, if you will, into Russia. Dr. Holmes, could you expand on the issue of human trafficking? I mean, it's a broad subject. Can you give us a little bit more on it?
It is very broad, and it changes daily. If we talk global, it goes on all the time. If we talk regional, we can address the specifics on where the folks are going. Like I said, trafficking is done internally and it's done transnationally. Okay, we understand that. So it's border to border and it's internal. Again, it's a very profitable industry. And I don't want to call it an industry, but it's become an industry. It's something that people are taking human beings, they're moving them for cheap labor, or they're using them for sexual exploitation. So to combat that, again, I go back to the word evil. It's almost impossible. So when we talk broadly, how do we combat trafficking of humans in any form or fashion, we have to be very aware. We have to know what's going on. Police officers have to be aware. Military has to be trained, right, when they're boots on the ground to see. Various areas of security, border crossings. So it's so large that there's so many different elements and parts and pieces to it. It's almost impossible to stop it. We can reduce it. We can be aware. We can monitor. And one of the things with Ukraine is, if you look at some of the statistics that come out from various different organizations, they've put forth anti-trafficking classes. They've done brochures. They've trained women. They've trained children. You know, for example, don't take a job abroad with rose-colored glasses, right? So many times people come in and go, hey, come be a nanny for me. They put them on a boat. They're in Turkey. They're gone. So it's trying to really help them understand that they can't just jump on in that car, jump on that boat because it's a better life for their family, because they're living in poverty as it is, and this looks like a better life. So it is education, but it's also putting someone in place, those elements in place to actually to protect the people, because they're not going to see it. They're going to see it as, this is an opportunity for me to remove myself from poverty, to help my family, etc. And, you know, for the viewers that are here today, there's a lot of very, very good programs out there, whether you go to YouTube or any other media, and you look at the human trafficking, and you look at how it's done. When they move, there's been women that they've rescued before, right? And they were prostituted, and 60 men a day were abusing this woman. She comes out of it to go back home, and she sees her family in complete poverty. You know, her brother's dying of cancer. What does she do? She goes back to it because it provides her with money. So it's you know, there's so many different elements. It's the psychological aspect. It's very deep. So when you say it's broad, it's very broad, but it's very, very hard also to get it right. You know, we're still working on it. We're trying to get it right.
You know, there's a thing on TikTok right now about if a person is in trouble, to raise their hand, put their thumb in, and close it over it like this. There's actually been a couple of saves here in the U.S. where women that have been abducted have done that, and observers saw that and called 911 and actually saved the individual. You know, so maybe this will become an international signal before too long. Mm-hmm. And on the subject of human trafficking, you know, the largest human trafficking sexual exploitation in the United States is our Super Bowl, where they bring in all kinds of ladies there and guys also, I'm sure, and exploit the daylights out of them at what is supposed to be a celebration. You know, yep. So it's really bad in that respect. Okay, I really want to shift the subject here, and this one is going to really come out of left field for you. But Nace, I want to go back to you for a moment here, and let's talk about war criminals. Do you think that what we're seeing with regards to the refugee situation is actually a criminal act by the state of Russia against the state of Ukraine?
Absolutely, I do. You know, it's amazing because if we think of all the movements and all the things that we've done around the world, whether it's Africa, wherever we're at, we always look at those countries of taking a human life. Syria, I mentioned that a few minutes ago, in 2015, right? Their own country, they were gassing them. And so they took refuge by crossing the border, traveling 2.5 months to get out. How do you prosecute the leaders and the people that are behind that, right? It is war crime, for sure. It's you're taking a life when you don't have a right to take that life. And for what reason? Just like Dr. Crowley said a few minutes ago, you know, Putin's been at this for a very, very long time, right? This has been in the making for a long time. Our special forces has been in there. Green Berets have been in training these folks, you know, trying to protect. And then all of a sudden they have to remove themselves because they see the war that's coming. But there should be some form, you know, of repercussions. There should be some type of trial. There should be international. These people should be brought to justice for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Dustin, as a career military guy, your training, you're probably horrified by some of the stuff you've seen here. Can you expand on that a little bit?
I mean, I've seen tank row that was burnt up, all the tanks there that it was just destroyed. It's like Fallujah. You kind of, I mean, I can relate it to Iraq. I can relate it to Afghanistan and some parts of Africa. It's, I don't know. It's mind blowing. It's just somber. You don't want to take pictures. You don't want to see anything like that passed around. And then next thing you know, it's all over the news, and the reporters are trying to report on it and say, hey, it's a somber moment. Well, if it's a somber moment, put down the camera and actually make it a somber moment. The fact that we are trying to televise everything about it takes away from just how powerful or how bad it is. If you're trying to put it on camera, you're trying to drop it down just a little bit. And I just don't think that should be done. It's bad.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And Dr. Crowley, we've seen where the Ukrainians have prosecuted one tank commander as a war criminal. How far up the chain do you think this will go before it's all over? You think that the international court will go after Putin himself and the military leaders underneath him?
It's certainly possible. And I think that the reply in kind will be sort of yet another chip away at the international order, quote unquote, right? Because Putin's not turning up for that trial. I mean, now you'll have, arguably leading world power, disengaging further from international systems of accountability. And there are a lot of efforts underway, within Ukraine or led or orchestrated by the West to document what's happened. How do we use social media, satellite imagery, people taking photographs of after the fact of infrastructure and the rest to build an evidence case for, reconstruction, whether it's reparations, accountability, etc. What is that going to look like? I'm very skeptical that the Russian government, quote unquote, will be involved in that at all. We may have frozen assets, and we can sort of, prosecute an empty chair effectively and allocate cash to Ukraine. All right, symbolic victory, etc., and you set the record straight, but that's not accountability. Talking to the Ukrainians, it's, there's some skepticism of the value in that. Where is the UN and all this? Aren't they supposed to kind of deal with this? On paper, yes. In reality, it doesn't happen. So I think the Ukrainians, again, this is a broad statement, but will come out of this war with a healthy skepticism toward international institutions, toward these frameworks, toward the idea of justice and accountability. The focus is on survival. The focus in equal parts probably is on revenge. And let's see how that plays out.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's see, Dr. Holmes, can you talk to the breadth of programs and organizations, specifically NGOs or whatever else is out there that are supporting Ukrainians in this massive humanitarian effort?
Oh, there's tons. There's tons. We've received phone calls from various organizations asking, what they can do to donate money and what's it costing, to do the breakdown, to do the budget. But again, it's manpower. We can get all the money that we need dumped into a bank account and sit there and look at the number, but it's getting those people out there. It's being able to move. These guys have seen the amounts of people. I know Dustin has. He mentioned a few minutes ago. It's such a large amount of people crossing those borders that it's impossible just to grab them all and move them safely, right? They're going here and there. They just want out of the war zone. They're trying to protect their family. So going to the NGOs, how do we do this? How do we promote? How do we join together? There's been times that we join other folks asking for help. Hey, we need you here. We got the money to do it. Let me shove this your way. Can you do this? We'll subcontract or on other projects that we worked on. That's what we have to do. We have to depend on people. So we need people, and money comes in as well, but we need to also have the people to be able to move this. The donations are sitting. I'm sure the folks that have been over there have seen pallets on the ground of food and stuff, but it's difficult to move it. I'm not going into Ukraine. I'm on the other side. These guys are getting aid, but they can't move it. So the NGOs are frustrated because they have all the supplies, they have everything that they've done, and they're like, we have all this stuff to help the people, but we can't help the people, if that makes sense to you. So that's the frustration on our side, trying to help people in need.
Yeah. I personally have been involved with humanitarian operations throughout the world, and we in the Air Force could take C-5 loads of equipment and supplies, and mainly it's water, food, and plastic for sheltering, and we can get it to the airport, but then how do you get it out to the country to support the people that really need it, especially when you're in a contested area with shelling and everything going on. So it is a real problem. Thank you. I want to shift gears for just a moment here. In previous conversations or forums here, we talked about the massive use of cyber attacks, social media attacks, disinformation campaigns. And this is sort of a first, if you will, in modern warfare. But something we've seen used extensively in this war is drones and drone warfare. And I'd like to ask Dr. Crowley his thinking on the use of drones. How effective has it been? And do you think we're going to see more and more of this in the future?
I mean, you're drifting out of my focal area in a way. But what I think you've definitely seen is improvisation, the use of off-the-shelf technology. The U.S. likes to build sort of the perfect thing, right? And it's expensive and it's multifaceted and it works really well and it requires a bunch of logistical support. And we sell that to our partners, and that has value. I think the Ukrainians have arguably benefited most from cheaper, simpler things, off-the-shelf, improvised stuff. Dustin was speaking, people setting up their own factories to modify, customize, adapt. There's a steep learning curve here, right? And the use of relatively inexpensive commercial technology modified for the battlefield is certainly a thing to come, and that's not a revelation on my part. Right? Lots of people will talk about that. And so the leveling effects of cheaply available, good enough tech, good enough kit to go after some of these obsolete weapon systems that can't defend themselves against that. The tank is getting a tough time in all the narratives around this war. What is the future of the tank? Were the Marines justified for giving up their tanks based upon what we've seen, in Ukraine? I can't speak to that. And I think this is one data point among many. But yeah, it's certainly been key as a sort of low-cost, lower-tech weapons platform, ISR platform, etc.
Yeah. So, Dustin, as a Marine who's seen combat, anytime that you can see over the horizon and see what your threat is an advantage to you. And I saw a report the other day where gamers in Ukraine were using commercial off-the-shelf drones to help out the military forces. Did you do any training on this? Did you witness any of this?
Yeah, I can speak firsthand on it. War's ever changing. So if someone invades America, we're dumb if we think we're not going to just go out to the stores and pick up whatever we can. DJI drones are stacked in rooms, and they're using them. They're using 3D printers to make release catches for the bottom of the drones to drop RPG rounds down. They're just trying to figure out the tactical way to use it. That way, Russia's really good at if you set down a drone like normal and you launch it up and it goes straight up and you fly it up to say 300 feet and then you're going to move it over to wherever you need to. Russia can have rounds where that drone took off in a matter of minutes, if that. So you're potentially taking out the controllers right off the bat. So they're actually fixing it now to where they're flying them at like 5 feet off the ground, which is coming from the gamers who are doing drone racing and all that stuff, where you throw on a set of goggles and I personally have to hold on to a railing when I'm watching it because I've tested a few of their drones. but they're barrel rolling through rubble and having no issues. And next, you know, they pop it up and they're 100 feet up and they're doing 100 miles an hour on these drones. Drones are a very effective tool that's being utilized against Russia right now. And there's really nothing you can do. I mean, they're jamming the DJIs and stuff, but there's always a workaround. They're coming up with it.
You know, Tom Callahan earlier talked about a tectonic change. I think once again, you're going to see a change in military operations based upon lessons learned from this war here that will transform militaries throughout the world, to say the least. I want to talk to the issue of rising fuel costs, transportation costs, lack of food that we're going to see in the Ukraine come this winter. Dr. Holmes, what do you think about this impact?
We're seeing it globally too, but again, it goes back to the question you asked a few minutes ago: how do we get the supplies to them? Right? If we have the supplies in Poland, or we have the supplies close by, Germany, et cetera, how do we get the supplies to these folks? Even, you know, the shortage is there. It's there when war started, right? They were out of food, they were out of water. We were trying everything we could to get food, water, clothing, trying to get people out, trying to take care of the people that were fighting. So now with the national food shortage, we have to understand there could be a shortage everywhere else, and then how much is going to be donated from this point forward, right? Everyone's going to kind of step back for a second, become very conservative with the way that they spend things, to, you know, just because it's a global problem at the moment. So I just find that it's going to be difficult to not only, we have the supplies to get the supplies there, but eventually we're going to see a shortage eventually.
Right. Okay. So I want you to look in your crystal balls for me. And Dustin, I'm going to start with you. How do you predict this ends?
I think it's going to be a long one. I mean, if you ask the Ukrainian, it's been going on for, I think they said 2014 is when it really actually kicked off in their eyes, and it's been going nonstop like that. Honestly, unless something radical happens in Russia, I don't see it ending anytime soon. Russia's proven they're willing to just throw whatever it takes at it, and they don't care. And there was talked about earlier about Russia's playbook is to threaten with nuclear weapons if anybody else is getting involved. It's just sad that we're at this time, like, we've come so far with so much stuff that we're gonna threaten you with this. Like, you're being a bully, knock it off, sit down. I don't know how it's gonna end. I don't think it's gonna be a good ending though. Yeah. Okay, and Dr. Crowley?
Yeah, I mean, there isn't an obvious end to this, you know, and, you know, this was a war that began with sort of maximalist objectives, like, we're going to take Kiev, you know, Ukraine will cease to exist. It was never a real country in the first place, and we'll bring our brothers back into the fold, et cetera, et cetera. And you can't really walk that back. You know, the Russians have taken territory that the Ukrainians want back, you know, above and beyond what was taken years ago. You know, you get a bloody stalemate in the East. I don't see how that ends anytime soon. Again, short of something dramatic in Russia. And, you know, the one upside, potentially, and there was talk this morning in this conference about the refugee problem. And, you know, my understanding is that the queue is to get back into Ukraine at the Polish border. A lot of people are coming home, you know, dads at home, husbands at home, grandpas at home, etc. These families are looking to get back. I'm less concerned about even medium-term refugee problems in Europe, provided this conflict, the war is contained in the East. And you're going to get a really challenging set of internally displaced people and the problems that come with that, where aid is coming in, who gets it? right? I mean, Ukraine is a huge country. It's a diverse country. It's a country that, again, it has been united on sort of nationalist, patriotic lines. But you look beneath that, and there's complexity there. There are challenges there. Who gets what? Corruption is going to be a massive issue in the distribution of aid. And I think the Ukrainians are going to be loath to give much in the way of oversight, with the view, quite fairly, that they've fought this fight. They're going to manage the aftermath. They'll welcome the assistance, they'll welcome the aid, but we're going to handle this. We'll take the lead on this. So, yeah, I mean, you wind up with sort of a much uglier and bloodier version of what you saw from 2014 on, with, low intensity, potentially more than that, violence along some new line of contact, which the Ukrainians, I think, will be increasingly emboldened to push at. Before, and again, this was very controversial, and the armed forces of Ukraine were under a broad order really not to fight back in the East. There was real tension in the armed forces about, we're taking artillery, we're taking sniper fire, we're taking casualties on a daily, if not, weekly basis. Why aren't we fighting back? Why aren't we pushing back? That restraint is gone now, I think. So any future line of contact is going to be much more of a back and forth exchange with the casualties to boot. So, there's I don't see a way out of it. And I don't know what some massive counteroffensive by the Ukrainians looks like without substantive outside intervention. I don't think is coming.
Okay, thank you. And Dr. Holmes, how long will this humanitarian crisis last? Let's assume the war ends in the next 3 months, okay? How many more years are we looking at of this humanitarian situation?
I'm going to say 10 plus. It's very difficult. Again, when you were speaking of, we were talking about the orphanages a few minutes ago. Again, the military folks have seen there's nothing there. So how long does it first take to rebuild Ukraine to provide housing for these Ukrainians that want to go back home? So you have refugees that move, but if they want to go back home, where do they go to? So we have to think of how long is it going to take to actually rebuild Ukraine before we can actually say, how do we get these people moved back? It's no different than when you think about, and this is on a much smaller scale, but how many times have in the States we've seen natural catastrophes, hurricanes, right? Katrina, it wipes out a whole community. It takes years, and that's a very small city that's on the Gulf of Mexico. You're talking about a country, that's a massive size. How long is it going to take for that rebuild? So we have to consider how long does it really take to get these people back up to before they can go back home. You have to rebuild the city first. So I would say that the time frame would be the rebuild first before we can consider getting these people back to normalcy, if there is ever normalcy. It's been destroyed, but the heart of these folks and the kindness that we have to provide to them is imperative. Princess Diana, served in many different capacities for humanitarian efforts. And if we think about something she said, carry out random acts of kindness with no expectation of reward, safe in the knowledge that one day somebody might do the same for you. And that's what we're doing right now. We're looking at people that need help, and we have to go help those folks. We also need to consider that when there's Russians, I live in Atlanta, Georgia, that walk up, they automatically are like, this is not us, this is not us. It's not them. We can't hold them accountable. We have to be kind. We have to know that we have to help these people get back on their feet. And it's going to take time. It's going to take years.
Okay, thank you. That's set the stage for our keynote closing speaker. So thank you for that also, okay? All right, so here's a question for you. Is there a face-saving exit strategy for Putin? How does he save face out of all of this? And let's see, Dr. Crowley, we'll go with you first.
I mean, I don't think it'll happen. I mean, he can always declare victory and go home. And control of the information environment in Russia is such that might work, but there's no guarantee. And I think that the risks accompanying any kind of abrupt, hey, we won, we're coming home domestically, I don't know. I don't see it, honestly. I think this thing grinds out, it grinds on. And let's see what costs Russia can bear here. Is it significant? The ruble has been all over the place. We were going to freeze Russia out of the financial universe, and that kind of hasn't happened if you read the fine print. So we'll see. Yeah, I don't have a real optimistic view on that one.
Yeah. Dustin, your thoughts? Exit for Putin?
I don't really. Does the individual seem like the type to just do something to save face? I don't think I don't think he's even thinking of what can I do to just save face on this. He's going to continue until he's happy with whatever comes with it, or until something happens drastically on that side. I don't think there's a save face. I think Dr. Crowley's correct. There's when you pick a fight, there's no way to just walk away without two black eyes or anything like that. And Putin doesn't seem like the type to just accept two black eyes.
Yeah. Okay. And from your point, Dr. Holmes, how does Putin exit this thing, or can he?
I think I agree with my other panelists here, and it's one of those things that you say he can't. I mean, I don't see how he can. If we're not in a situation like Osama bin Laden, right, to where we were affected by it, and our military could go in and take care of a leader that was doing heinous crimes to not just Americans but other folks, and you military yourself, sir. But it's a matter of, does his own people control that? Does his own people, the Russian people, take over? There's movements right now in Russia with younger folks that are like, we don't want this. We want peace. We want Russia back to what it was, because it's impacted their society. It's impacted their country. And it may be just one of those things to where they try, and then it would take almost like a civil war themselves to remove him from power, and the upper brass for him. I don't know. I'm with these folks. It's just mind-boggling that hands are tied around the world, that they really can't even get to Putin like they wish they could. So,
right. Okay. All right. So the last question, in the unthinkable, what if there is release of a weapon of mass destruction, i.e. a chemical attack or some sort of nuclear attack? The effects that would have on the humanitarian crisis we've got right now would be profound, because you would see civilians rushing towards exits, if you would. What do you see as far as that goes, Dr. Holmes?
Well, right now there's an overload, right? It would be 100 times more disastrous, and you wouldn't be able to move the people. That's why we need. Again, we talk about donations, we talk about boots on the ground. Right now, it's moving those people. We've thought about it. We've discussed it within our group of folks about if they were to drop, even smaller nukes or smaller weaponry that they could use. I don't know. I don't know the answer to how to do that, because right now our concern are the people that are trying to get away from that, trying to get away from war. We don't even want to think about that, because the disaster and what these folks are going through right this minute is so bad. The thoughts of nuclear, it would end them, emotionally, because you just don't want to think that way. So I don't know. It's just, it's a tough situation right now, and it would get probably 100 times tougher if that were to happen.
Okay. Well, I want to thank the panelists for your expertise, for your sharing of your ideas and your thinking, and to you two that were on boots on the ground out there training the Ukrainians prior to this. My personal thanks as a military man for what you've done over there in preparing them, working with the Ukrainian military and the civilians and getting them ready. And Dr. Holmes, I think you've done a great job of representing your university on an international stage out there. So my congratulations and thanks on that. To all of you, thank you so much for your time, your energy, and your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Our final speaker today is a Brigadier General Bob Brink. And my last question was to set the stage. Militarily, there's two kinds of evacuations. There's a non-contested, which is what we got going on right now today. It's what we had going on in Hurricane Katrina, where we're trying to evacuate citizens and take supplies and everything in. And General Bob Brink, a personal friend, a tremendous strategic thinker, succeeded at every level in the Air Force he ever had, was very, very well thought of inside the Pentagon as a strategic political thinker. He ended up commanding what was known as a contingency response wing, and his wing went into New Orleans after the disaster from Hurricane Katrina down there. He's going to talk about that, but then he's going to transition into the potential contested evacuation, such as we saw in Afghanistan, where you actually had the 82nd Airborne surround an airfield and set it up so that you could get the citizens of Afghanistan and the military folks and citizens from other nations to an airport to get them out. And the 82nd Airborne, which Tom Callahan talked about earlier, is in Poland right now, and they're doing a phenomenal job. However, they're not just there to do a phenomenal job inside of Poland. If things go south, the 82nd will be the tip of the spear for a contested neo-evacuation. And that's what General Brink is going to talk about, is non-contested and contested evacuation. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to General Bob Brink.
Good morning. My name is Bob Brink, and I'm a retired Brigadier General from the United States Air Force. And one of the most rewarding jobs I had in the Air Force was to command the initial contingency response wing. We stood up the capability for a contingency response wing after the march to Baghdad, when your military learned that as forces were marching on the way to Baghdad and taking over airfields and clearing them of enemy presence, we missed an opportunity that we could have gone in and operated from local airfields as opposed to flying in from other countries to do air operations in Iraq. So we were a gap fill for a capability that was missing. So the mission of a contingency response wing is to bring in tailored cross-functional forces to assess, open, secure, and operate an airfield in a contingency environment. So we brought together the forces required. We built the skill sets required. We learned the mission as we went along and learned from the experience of others. And we were up and running in a matter of about 6 months. We were headed for a big test of our capability at Operation Bright Star in Cairo. But before we left for Cairo, I brought the senior leadership together on a Friday afternoon with a big tub of beer and soft drinks and asked them, did anyone in the room think that the United States of America was going to march to Baghdad again? And they all looked down and said, well, hopefully not. And I said, then how are we relevant on a day-to-day basis? And the room went quiet. So I said, we're not going anywhere till we figure this out or the beer's gone. So grab one and let's start talking. And over the next several hours, we figured out that contingency operations are not combat specific. Contingency operations are going to be more prevalent in a humanitarian environment. So our first wing level exercise generated by our team was Wilmington, North Carolina has been devastated by a hurricane that hit the East Coast. It's cut off from the mainland. The electricity is out. The water is questionable. We need to open up the airfield and the airport in Wilmington, North Carolina, and start relief flow. Who's on our side? Who are we working with? What are the hospitals and police forces and military that are potentially at play? Go. 3 days later, I got the full out brief from our team, and they did a masterful job of identifying how the force protection would work, how the airfield would be assessed, who would be coming in to open the airfield, and all the steps required to do the things to get the relief flow up and running in a safe and efficient manner that would restore order in a pretty close order. Why is that important? Because we got to Bright Star in Egypt, and that exercise was going very, very well. We were working with the Egyptian Air Force opening up airfields, bringing in fighters, bringing in heavies, opening up another airfield, bringing in more fighters, bringing in more heavies. And then we saw the news, and I pulled one of my commanders off to the side and I said, Rich, you're going to hate me, but I'm sending you and your team home. He said, you're right, I hate you. I said, there's a storm brewing in the Gulf of Mexico. It's headed for New Orleans. I need you home in case that storm slams into the coast. I will be forever remembered by putting my hand on his shoulder saying, don't worry, I think Katrina will peter out before she ever hits the shoreline. Boy, was I wrong. You need to understand some basics if you're going to put your feet into the contingency airfield operations arena. First thing you need to understand is what's the mission statement. Mission statements, like personal goals, should be smart, measurable, attainable, realistic and relevant, and time-bound. So when you have your mission statement and you're getting ready to set up at an airfield, the things that come into mind first are the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy. You need to protect yourself. You need to protect your passengers, patients, and the people that are helping you run the airfield. You need to be able to secure the airfield and the operating environment where your people are working, which means securing the airplanes. And then you need to assess the security outside of the airfield. In a lesser developed country, you may have a very different environment than you would have in Wilmington, North Carolina. And finally, for the force protection, as you're bringing people out, you need to be able to screen them to know that you're bringing out people that really do need to be brought out. And from an aerial port perspective, you need to have the capability to load and unload airplanes. And anytime you put something on an airplane, you need to make sure that it's safe. So you need to make sure you're not moving hazardous material, you're not moving criminals, you're not moving firearms. And lastly, on the aerial port side, you need to be able to reconfigure airplanes to have a medical evacuation capability. On a maintenance perspective, we really didn't want to have a lot of maintenance. We wanted to be able to have enough maintenance to keep the airplanes moving. You really don't want to have a broken jet sitting on the ramp, taking up the space of somebody who could be contributing to the whole effort. I'm going to run through 3 examples that will help provide some background to the discussion about Ukraine. The first one we'll talk about is a relatively simple mission, the Hurricane Rita-inspired evacuation of Beaumont, Texas. The second one we'll talk about is a very complex operation, the Hurricane Katrina relief operation into Louis Armstrong Airport. That was a mission that was complex to start with, became more complex because the players in the environment changed over time, the mission changed over time, and we wound up being in New Orleans for a while. And finally, the Kabul evacuation, the same group of airmen, the same unit, the 621st Contingency Response Wing, was doing all 3 of these. Okay, the mission was being executed by the same unit, not the same airmen, clearly, but given the time disparities. But a lot of lessons learned went into play, and a lot of things worked well, a lot of things didn't. First, Beaumont, Texas. September 24th, 2005, while most of the 621st Contingency Response Wing was ensconced in New Orleans, Hurricane Rita was cruising along the Gulf Coast, headed for Beaumont, Texas. The United States Air Force got the call that there were a lot of intensive care units, hospitals, and nursing homes in Beaumont, Texas that were not going to be able to be evacuated ahead of the hurricane because of the evacuation flow and the clogged roads. And so we had a bunch of patients who needed to get out now. The 621st sent a contingency response team headed by a young captain to go to that one ramp that you see on the picture there to provide the loading and unloading of airplanes and to prioritize which patients get married up with which capabilities. An ambulatory nursing home patient can get on a passenger airplane. Someone coming out of an ICU with IVs on a gurney needs to go onto a bona fide medevac platform with attending healthcare. And so matching them up, having the Air Force marry them up and prioritize them and triage who gets on airplanes first had to be done to make sure that everybody could get out in a reasonable time. Talked about time bounding of the mission. The hurricane was coming. You had to have people out, or as many out as you possibly could, before the hurricane. This team was up for about 36 hours straight, without rest, with a lot of coffee. And the last airplane that took off out of Beaumont, Texas was a C-17 with the contingency response team on board. As they went wheels up, the tower announced that they were closing and evacuating the tower because the winds were now out of limits for the airfield to continue operating. A simple operation with a simple goal to evacuate patients and nursing home residents and to get it done in a finite period of time. Very successful. Had a 2-star general call me up afterwards, said there's probably a handful of people who could have unscrewed Beaumont, Texas when he arrived, and young Tim Niedermeyer was the guy to do it. So a wonderful example of a successful mission. 4 weeks prior to that, the contingency response, 817th Contingency Response Group came into New Orleans on August 31st, 2 days after the hurricane had run over and flooded New Orleans. The airport was on high ground. People had taken refuge in the terminal. They were using the ticket counters as bathrooms. There were fights, there were knife fights, there were a lot of, shall we say, bad elements preying on other folks in the terminal. Our team came on board, and that area with the green box was an open field at the time. That's now the site of the new terminal. That open field we set up for the 101st Airborne when they came in, so that they would have a place to set up their tents. We operated in the ramp below that green box, the existing ramp and the existing terminal, and that's where we loaded and unloaded airplanes off the east-west runway. The maintenance was provided for us on all kinds of different aircraft. The aerial port operation indeed became sporting. We had airplanes coming in with water and medicine and relief supplies, and airplanes going out with people who wanted to get out of New Orleans and go make it to some relatives or someplace else outside of New Orleans. These are people who had been defending their homes. They had been defending themselves against looters and criminals. They showed up at the airport with handguns and hunting rifles and other weapons. We told them that you can't take the loaded weapon onto an airplane, and several got very upset, very animated. You can't deny my Second Amendment right to have this weapon. And that's very true. We can't take your weapon, but we can tell you that you can't get on the airplane with your weapon. So either you can get on the airplane without your weapon, or you can stay here with your weapon. But the criteria for you to be evacuated is to leave the weapon behind. And so we put a lot of weapons in boxes and secured them and turned them over to the authorities later on in the operation. The criteria for mission complete evolved. We had partners in the National Guard and in FEMA and in local relief organizations, and that evolved as the relief operation evolved over time. We had fewer people being evacuated out, more relief supplies coming in. And in the midst of all this, we had to be ready for pop-ups. Al Gore paid for an airplane to bring in relief supplies. Didn't tell anybody it was coming. It just showed up and said, here we are, unload us. We didn't have the capability to unload a civilian cargo plane, essentially a 767 cargo plane. So we had to create a human chain and unload the boxes one at a time, person to person, handing them down the stairs, which meant everybody was pulled away from the other relief operations to handle that one airplane so we could get it off the ramp and get back to business as usual. We had a pretty good control over the flow, but you can't have control over everything. The contingency response folks got there on August 31st. They got home in time for our Christmas party. They were on the ground for several months, and that mission evolved and moved. And the composition of forces and the number of people that we had down there evolved over time. But we kept up with the mission complete when we turned over the airfield to the city and to the National Guard, and we're able to come home. A complex mission statement, a complex operation that wasn't really time-bound and evolved the whole time we were there. Kabul, Hamid Karzai International Airport. We protected ourselves, the Army protected us, the Taliban controlled the airfield and the access to the airfield. Screening refugees was a problem because criteria for who was allowed out evolved. The initial mission was to assist in the evacuation of Americans. That was the guidance. Who qualified for evacuation, who didn't qualify for evacuation, seemed to evolve with the more people who went up in arms about being left behind. We had to control the flow of people. We had to control the crowds at the gates. We had panicked locals. We had people coming out of the airport. We had U.S. citizens and employees and third country nationals. And again, firearms were everywhere. We were doing our own maintenance. We didn't have a lot of civilian traffic, thank goodness, but we had to be able to handle the traffic that we did have. If you start at the Barron Hotel at the bottom of this diagram, you'll see a main road that goes right up to the Abbey Gate. That was the main path coming onto the airport property. We went around the civilian side to the military side to evacuate people off the airfield. The Taliban controlled the airfield perimeter. The Taliban controlled the flow of people onto the airport. If you wanted to get on the airport and you thought you were worthy of being evacuated, then you had to show the Americans that you were worthy of being evacuated. The application for a visa based on your service to the Americans meant you were carrying a letter from your commander saying how important you were to supporting the American forces for the last 20 years in Afghanistan. But if the Taliban saw you with that letter, they would arrest you. And that was essentially a death sentence. So people were caught in a catch-22. They couldn't get on the airfield without going through the Taliban, and they couldn't get out without exposing themselves and the role they had played to the Americans. The operation was going on when there was an explosion at the Barron Hotel and an explosion at the Abbey Gate. A lot of people were injured. That was the main flow of people coming into the evacuation flow, and that essentially ended the evacuation. Where we were in New Orleans for months, we were in Kabul for 11 days. There were a lot of people that were left behind because when we decided that the price of casualties was unacceptable, the administration pulled the plug on the operation, and that's where you get those horrific pictures of people flooding onto the runway, hanging onto airplanes and falling off from the airplanes as they flew away. Politics played a huge role in how this operation was run and how it was terminated. The mission statement was determined politically. The prep time for the mission was determined politically. If you look back to Beaumont, Texas, and the simple time-bound mission, Katrina with a complex but eventually time-bound mission, and you compare this to Kabul, it becomes really complicated really quickly, and the lack of allies and the lack of other participants on the ground and lack of control of the environment was absolutely an Achilles heel for this operation. Why is this important? These are the things that you have to think about when people say, why can't we do humanitarian operations in Ukraine? Why can't we be flying in and out of airfields there? Why can't we be doing something else to help the population of the Ukraine? You would have to define a mission. Is it humanitarian relief? Are you bringing in food, water, shelter, and medicine? Are you bringing in people to handle crises on the ground and to handle medical needs on the ground? If so, what is your success criteria? What is your time frame, and who's going to be doing it? Probably would be run by the 435th Contingency Response Group out of Ramstein. They are experienced at operating all over Europe. They've done all kinds of operations in Eastern Europe before. This would not be a new territory for them. You would have allies in NATO and the EU, but if NATO's involved, the Russians have got to be out of the way. The shooting has got to be stopped. Before you can fly a NATO airplane into that airspace, you've got some other criteria that have to be met. The environment has got to be conducive to doing humanitarian relief. You need to know what the threats are around the airfield and to aircraft. You need to know if there's terrorists and insurgents. You need to look at medical hazards. With the level of destruction that's going on in Ukraine, you're going to have cholera. You're going to have diseases that we don't see on a regular basis. And you're going to have a lot of problems with medicine and starvation that are going to pop up. There's a nonprofit based out of South Carolina, where I am right now, that was feeding the hungry in Ukraine, and they have changed their mission statement to feeding the starving. When you start to bring in relief and you start bringing in food, it's going to create crowd control issues, and you need to be ready for it. Lots of candidate airfields. You can see from the diagram, Ukraine has a robust airfield infrastructure. Where do the Ukrainians want the flow to come to? Who's going to meet the flow? Who's going to do the distribution? What's the road network like? Is it secure? Understanding the distribution of relief aid was a weak area in Mogadishu. Who was getting the relief and how is it getting to the people in need? That whole logic and the outflow needs to be thought out before we start priming the pump, or you can create a humanitarian disaster where you tried to provide humanitarian relief. So having a mission, having it well-defined, knowing who's involved, and understanding the environment are absolutely critical to being able to think about providing humanitarian relief in Ukraine. Now, there are some people out there who are asking, why are we not dropping humanitarian daily rations in Ukraine like we did in Kosovo? Those orange packets of high-calorie, high-density nutrition that can be dropped on people who are starving. Again, you have to have permissive airspace to get in and do that. Otherwise, you're going to create a shooting war where you really probably didn't want one. So as you start talking about humanitarian relief in the Ukraine, please remember the basics. What is your mission statement? Is it SMART? Is it specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-bounded? How are you going to do your force protection? Who's going to run the airfield and the aerial port for loading and unloading? And who's going to be able to provide maintenance in a place like Ukraine where you have Russian and Soviet-built airplanes, you have European-built airplanes, and you have American-built airplanes, all coming in with different requirements and maintenance requirements. Who's going to provide fuel? Do you have water? Do you have electricity? Where are the people running the relief operation going to stay? All of the foundational elements need to line up before you can have a coherent and successful humanitarian relief operation. This is a topic that I'm passionate about. I dedicated a good part of my life and my career to doing this and standing up this capability. It needs to be thought through very carefully before you jump in with both feet, because we have both good and bad examples in our history. I'll turn you back to General Gray and let him field questions. And thank you very much for the opportunity to present about contingency operations.
Okay, General Rank, thank you so much for that education there. The vast majority of us are not familiar at all with airfield operations, let alone HUMRO, humanitarian relief operations, and you gave us a great insight into the complexities that's out there. So thank you very much for that, Bob. I tremendously appreciate it. Today's been a very instructive day, starting off with Dr. Jody McBrain, just a phenomenal discussion about the educational impacts on the entire population of the children, and it's a generational impact, to say the least. And how's that going to affect the rest of Europe, as Dr. Callahan talked about, and Mr. Tom Callahan talked about in his discussion with the tectonic changes that we've got coming from this war. And then we moved into a food crisis discussion that's going to have years-long impact, to say the least. And it's not going to get better anytime soon. It's going to continue to grow. And our panelists talked about that. Specifically, Dr. Holmes talked about the humanitarian impact, the crisis we're going to have. This winter is going to get intensified with the cold weather, lack of fuel and oil, and lack of food. And then we had two folks who had boots on the ground in the Ukraine prior to the invasion, Dr. Nicholas Crowley and Dustin Osterberg, who gave us great insight into the fighting spirit of the men and women of not just the military, but the average citizen who was taking up their pitchforks, so to speak, to stand against the Russian invasion. Absolutely great insights, great personal stories, and it let us see the fortitude that President Zelensky and the Ukrainian folks have come to unite against the Russian invasion. My thanks again to USF and Dr. Holbrook for you and your staff and everybody else. Kelly, a personal thank you to you, and Bill, to you also for making this possible. I've tremendously enjoyed it, and I've learned an awful lot. Casey, over to you to talk about the next one.
Thank you, General Gray. And on behalf of the Institute for Public Policy and Leadership here at the University of South Florida, thank you for joining us today. I want to again thank our partners, the Air Force Association and the West Coast of Florida chapter, the Florida Center for Cybersecurity at the University of South Florida, Security Management International, the University of South Florida Sarasota Manatee Campus, the Global Interdependence Center, and Research One at the University of South Florida. As General Gray mentioned, join us for our next Ukraine What's Next, Part 5, which is the Hearts and Minds on June 8th. And we're going to explore disinformation and propaganda around the war in Ukraine. Thank you again for joining us and have a great rest of your day.